梁歌制作，林家铺子，作者毛盾。林小姐这天从学校回来就撅起着小嘴唇，她灌下了书包，并不照例到镜台前梳头发擦粉，却倒在床上看着帐顶出神。小花扑的也跳上床来。
Production by Liang Gu, Lin's shop, author, Mao Dun. 1. Miss Lin pursed her lips when she came back from school that day. She took off her school bag, and instead of going to the mirror to comb her hair and apply powder, she fell on the bed and stared at the ceiling in trance. Xiaohua also jumped on the bed.
挨着林小姐的腰部摩擦，咪呜咪呜的叫了两声。林小姐本能的伸手到小花头上摸了一下，随即翻一个身，把脸埋在枕头里，就叫道：“妈呀！”没有回答。妈的房就在建壁。
Rubbing against Miss Lin's waist, she let out 2 moans. Miss Lin instinctively reached out and touched Xiaohua's head, then turned over, buried her face in the pillow, and shouted, "Mom." No answer. Mom's room is next door.
妈素常疼爱着唯一的女儿，听得女儿回来就要摇摇摆摆走过来问她肚子饿不饿，妈留着好东西呢，再不然就差吴妈赶快去买一碗馄饨。但今天却作怪，妈的房里明明有说话的声音。
My mother always loved her only daughter. When her daughter came back, she would waddle over and ask her if she was hungry. Mom had kept some good things. Otherwise, she would have to buy a bowl of wontons quickly. But something went wrong today. There were clearly voices in Mom's room.
并且还听得妈在打饿，却是妈连回答也没有一声。林小姐在床上又翻一个身，翘起了头，打算偷听妈和谁谈话，是那样悄悄地放低了声音。然而听不清，只有妈的连声打饿。
And I heard my mother burping, but she didn't even answer. Miss Lin turned over on the bed again, raised her head, and planned to eavesdrop on whom her mother was talking to, so she quietly lowered her voice. However, I couldn't hear clearly, only my mother's hiccups.
间歇地飘到林小姐的耳朵。忽然妈的嗓音高了一些，似乎很生气，就有几个字听得很分明。这也是东洋货，那也是东洋货，林小姐猛一跳。
It drifted intermittently to Miss Lin's ears. Suddenly my mother's voice rose a little higher, as if she was very angry, and a few words were clearly audible, It drifted intermittently to Miss Lin's ears. Suddenly my mother's voice rose a little higher, as if she was very angry, and a few words were clearly audible, This is also a Japanese product, and that is also a Japanese product, Miss Lin jumped violently.
就好像理发时候颈脖子上沾了许多短头发似的，浑身都烦躁起来了。正也是为了这东洋货问题，他在学校里给人家笑骂，他回家来没好气。他一手推开了又挨到他身边来的小花。
It was as if there were a lot of short hair stuck to my neck during a haircut, and I felt irritated all over. It was precisely because of this issue of Japanese goods that she was laughed at and scolded by others in school, and she came home unhappy. She pushed away Xiaohua, who came to her again.
跳起来就剥下那件新制的翠绿色假毛葛驼绒旗袍来，拎在手里抖了几下，叹一口气。据说这怪好看的假毛葛和驼绒都是东洋来的。他撩开这件驼绒旗袍。
He jumped up and peeled off the newly made emerald green fake fur kudzu camel hair cheongsam. He shook it a few times in his hand and sighed. It is said that these beautiful fake fur kudzu and camel hair come from the east. She lifted up the camel hair cheongsam.
从床下拖出那口小巧的牛皮箱来，赌气似的扭开了箱子盖，把箱子底朝天向床上一撒，花花绿绿的衣服和杂用品就滚满了一床。小花吃了一惊，扑地跳下床去，转一个身。
He pulled out the small leather box from under the bed, opened the lid of the box angrily, and threw the box bottom up onto the bed. Colorful clothes and miscellaneous items rolled all over the bed. Xiaohua was startled, jumped out of bed, and turned around.
却又跳在一张椅子上蹲着望住她的女主人。林小姐的一双手在那堆衣服里抓捞了一会儿，就呆呆地站在床前出神。这许多衣服和杂用品越看越可爱，却又越看越像是东洋货呢。
But he jumped on a chair and squatted down to look at its mistress. Miss Lin's hands dug into the pile of clothes for a while, then she stood in front of the bed, lost in thought. The clothes and miscellaneous items are getting cuter and cuter, but they also look more and more like Oriental goods.
全都不能穿了吗？可是他舍不得，而且他的父亲也未必肯另外再制新的。林小姐忍不住眼圈红了。她爱这些东洋货，她又恨那些东洋人，好好的发兵打东三省干嘛呢？不然
Can't wear them all? But she couldn't bear to part with it, and her father might not be willing to make a new one. Miss Lin couldn't help but have red eyes. She loves these Japanese goods, but she hates those Japanese people. Why would she send troops to attack the 3 eastern provinces? Otherwise.
穿了东洋货，有谁来笑骂？忽然房门边来了这一声。 接着就是林大娘的摇摇摆摆的瘦身形。看见那乱丢了一床的衣服，又看见女儿只穿着一件绒线短衣站在床前出神。
Who will laugh and scold me if I wear Japanese goods? Well. Suddenly there was this sound from the door. Then came Mrs. Lin's swaying slim figure. I saw the clothes scattered all over the bed, and then I saw my daughter standing in front of the bed in a trance wearing only a woolen short coat.
林大娘这已经非同小可，心里愈是着急，她那个饿却愈是打得多，暂时竟说不出半句话。林小姐飞跑到母亲身边，哭丧着脸说：“妈呀，全是东洋货，明叫我穿什么衣服？”
Aunt Lin's surprise was no small matter. The more anxious she felt, the more, she said, and she couldn't say a word for the time being. Miss Lin flew to her mother's side and said with a sad face, "Oh my God. They're all Japanese goods. What should I wear tomorrow?"
林大娘摇着头，只是打饿，一手扶住了女儿的肩膀，一手揉磨自己的胸脯。过了一会儿，她方才挣扎出几句话来：“阿南，饿，你干嘛脱的？饿，光落落。留心动，饿，我这毛病，饿。”
Mrs. Lin shook her head and just hiccuped. She held her daughter's shoulder with one hand and rubbed her breast with the other. After a while, she struggled to say a few words, why did you take off all of your clothes, naked? Pay attention to the problem of freezing, my problem,
生你那年起了这个病痛，近来越发凶了。妈呀，你说明儿我穿什么衣服？我只好躲在家里不出去了，他们要笑我，骂我。但是林大娘不回答，她一路打饿。
I had this illness the year I gave birth to you, and, it's gotten worse recently. Oh my God. Can you tell me what to wear? I had no choice but to hide at home and not go out. They wanted to laugh at me and scold me. But Mrs. Lin didn't answer. She hiccuped all the way.
走到床前，捡出那件驼绒旗袍来，就替女儿披在身上，又拍拍床，要她坐下。小花又挨到林小姐脚边，昂起了头，眯细着眼睛看看林大娘，又看看林小姐，然后她懒懒地靠到林小姐的脚背上。
He walked to the bed and picked out the camel hair cheongsam, put it on her daughter, patted the bed and asked her to sit down. The little flower came to Miss Lin's feet again, raised its head, squinted its eyes and looked at Aunt Lin, then at Miss Lin, then it lazily leaned on Miss Lin's instep.
就林小姐的鞋底来摩擦她的肚皮。林小姐一脚踢开了小花，就是身子一歪，躺在床上，把脸藏在她母亲的身后。暂时两个都没有话。母亲忙着打饿，女儿忙着盘算明天怎样出去。
Use Miss Lin's salts to rub its belly. Miss Lin kicked Xiaohua away, leaned over, and lay on the bed, hiding her face behind her mother. Neither of them spoke for the time being. The mother is busy burping, and the daughter is busy thinking about how to go out tomorrow.
这东洋货问题不但影响到林小姐的所穿，还影响到她的所用。据说她那只常为同学们艳羡的化妆皮夹以及自动铅笔之类，也都是东洋货，而她却又爱这些小玩意儿的。阿难，
This problem of Japanese goods not only affects what Ms. Lin wears, but also what she uses. It is said that her cosmetic wallet and mechanical pencils, which are often envied by her classmates, are also Japanese goods, but she loves them. These little gadgets. Grandma,
肚子饿不饿？林大娘坐定了半晌以后，渐渐少打几个饿了，就又开始她日常的疼爱女儿的老功课。不饿，妈呀，怎么老是问我饿不饿呢？顶要紧是没有了衣服，明天怎样去上学？
Are you hungry? After Aunt Lin sat still for a while, she gradually stopped typing a few times, and then started her daily routine of loving her daughter. I'm not hungry, oh, my God, why do you always ask me if I'm hungry? I'm not hungry, but the most important thing is how to go to school tomorrow without clothes.
林小姐撒娇说，依然那样蜷曲着身体躺着，依然把脸藏在母亲背后。自始就没弄明白，为什么女儿竟嚷着没有衣服穿的林大娘，现在第3次听得了这话，不能不再注意了。
Miss Lin said coquettishly, still lying with her body bent like that, still hiding her face behind her mother's back. Aunt Lin, who had never understood why her daughter complained that she had no clothes to wear, heard this for the 3rd time and couldn't stop paying attention.
可是她那该死的打饿很不作美的又连连来了。恰在此时，林先生走了进来，手里拿着一张字条，脸上乌霉霉的，像是涂着一层灰。他看见林大娘不住在地打饿。
But her damn hiccups came again and again in a very unflattering way. Just at this moment, Mr. Lin walked in, holding a note in his hand, and his face seemed to be covered with a layer of dust. He saw Mrs. Lin hiccuping.
女儿躺在满床乱丢的衣服堆里，他就料到了几分，一双眉头就紧紧地皱起。他唤着女儿的名字说道：“明秀， 你的学校里有什么抗日会吗？刚送来了这封信。
His daughter was lying on the bed among the piles of clothes scattered all over the bed. He had already expected it, and his brows furrowed tightly. He called his daughter's name and said, Mingxiu, is there any anti-Japanese association in your school? This letter was just sent.
说是明天你再穿东洋货的衣服去，他们就要烧呢，无法无天的话语，可……真是岂有此理！哪一个人身上没有东洋货，却偏偏找定了我们家来生事？
He said that if you wear Japanese clothes tomorrow, they will burn them, lawless words, It's really unreasonable. Who doesn't have Japanese goods on his body, but he has chosen to cause trouble in our family.
哪一家洋广货铺子里不是堆足了东洋货，偏是我的铺子犯法，一定要封存。林先生气愤愤地又加了这几句，就颓然坐在床边的一张椅子里。救苦救难观世音，爸爸。
Which foreign goods shop is not full of Japanese goods? But my shop is against the law and must be sealed. Duh. Mr. Lin added these words angrily, and then sat slumped in a chair beside the bed. Save the suffering Guanyin, Dad.
我还有一件老式的棉袄，光景不是东洋货，可是穿出去人家又要笑我。过了一会儿，林小姐从床上坐起来说，她本来打算进一步要求父亲制一件不是东洋货的新衣。
I also have an old-fashioned cotton padded jacket, which is not from Japan, but people will laugh at me when I wear it. After a while, Miss Lin sat up from the bed and said that she had planned to further ask her father to make a new dress that was not Japanese.
但瞧着父亲的脸色不对，便又不敢冒昧。同时，他的想象中就展开了那件旧棉袄惹人讪笑的情形，他忍不住哭起来了。莫哭，没有人笑你。阿南，阿秀，明天不用去读书了。
But seeing the wrong look on his father's face, he didn't dare to take the risk. At the same time, the ridicule of that old cotton-padded jacket unfolded in her imagination, and she couldn't help crying. Don't cry, no one is laughing at you. Grandma, Axiu, you don't have to go to school tomorrow.
饭快要没得吃了，还读什么书？林先生懊恼地说，把手里那张字条扯得粉碎，一边走出房去，一边叹气跺脚。然而没多几时，林先生又匆匆地跑了回来，看着林大娘的面孔说道
We're almost out of food, so why should we read? Mr. Lin said angrily, tore the note in his hand to pieces, and walked out of the room, sighing and stamping his feet. However, not long after, Mr. Lin hurried back again, looked at Mrs. Lin's face and said,
厨门上的钥匙呢？给我。林大娘的脸色立刻变成灰白，瞪出了眼睛望着她的丈夫，永远不放松她的打恶，忽然静定了半晌。没有办法，只好去摘那些闲神野鬼了。林先生顿住了。
Where's the key on the cupboard door? Give me. Mrs. Lin's face immediately turned gray and she stared at her husband with her eyes wide open. She never let go. Her hiccup suddenly calmed down for a while. There is no other way but to go to those leisurely places in Zhaizhai. It's a ghost. Mr. Lin paused.
叹一口气，然后又接下去说，至多我花400块。要是党部里还嫌少，我拼着不做生意，等他们来封。我们对过的玉昌祥进的东洋货比我多，足足有1万多块钱的码子呢，也只花了500块。
He sighed, and then continued. I'll spend at most 400 yuan. If it's not enough for the party headquarters, I'll try not to do business and wait for them to close it. Yu Changxiang, whom we met, bought more Japanese goods than me, a full 10,000 yuan. Even though the code cost a lot of money, it only cost 500 yuan.
就太平无事了，500块，算是吃了几笔倒账罢。要是那一个金项圈总可以兑成300块。真好比强盗。林大娘摸出那钥匙来，手也颤抖了，眼泪扑簌簌地往下掉。林小姐却反不哭了。
It would be peaceful. 500 yuan. It's like having a few bad debts. Key. Cough. That gold necklace can always be exchanged for 300 yuan. Really, like a robber. Mrs. Lin took out the key, her hands trembled, and tears fell down. Miss Lin stopped crying.
瞪着一对泪根，呆呆地出神。他恍惚看见那个曾经到他学校里来演说，而且恶狗似的盯住看他的什么委员，一个怪叫人讨厌的黑麻子，捧住了他家的金项圈，在半空里跳。
Staring at a pair of tears, she was in a daze, and she vaguely saw the committee member who once came to her school to give a speech and stared at her like a hungry dog, a weird and annoying black pockmark, holding her house. Gold necklace jumping in midair.
张开了大嘴巴笑。随后，他 他又恍惚看见这强盗似的黑麻子和他的父亲吵嘴，父亲被他打了。哎呦！林小姐猛然一声惊叫，就扑在他妈的身上。林大娘慌得没有功夫进打饿，挣扎着说：“阿难
Open your mouth and smile. Then, she vaguely saw this gangster-like black pockmark arguing with her father, and her father was beaten by him. Ah! Miss Lin suddenly screamed and threw herself on her mother. Mrs. Lin was so panicked that she had no time to hiccup and struggled to say, Grandma.
不要哭，过了年，你爸爸有钱就给你织新衣服。那些狠心的强盗，都咬定我们有钱。一年一年亏空，你爸爸做肥田粉生意又上当。店里全是别人的钱了。阿难，我这病。
Don't cry. After the new year, your father will make new clothes for you if he has money. Those cruel robbers. They all insist that we are rich, and losing money year after year. Your father's fertilizer business was deceived again. The store is all filled with other people's money. Grandma, I'm sick.
活着也受罪。再过2年，你19岁，招得个好女婿。我死也放心了。救苦救难观世音菩萨。第二天，林先生的铺子里新换过一番布置。
You will suffer even while you are alive. Well, in 2 years, you will be 19 and you will find a good son-in-law. Well, I don't worry about dying. Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva who saves suffering. 2. The next day, Mr. Lin's shop had a new layout.
将近1星期不曾露脸的东洋货又都摆在最惹眼的地位了。林先生又模仿上海大商店的办法，写了许多大廉价照码9折的红绿纸条贴在玻璃窗上。这天是阴历腊月23。
The Japanese goods that had not been seen for nearly a week were once again placed in the most eye-catching position. Mr. Lin also imitated the method of big stores in Shanghai and wrote many red and green notes saying 10% off big discounts and pasted them on the glass windows. This day is the 23rd day of the 12th lunar month.
正是乡镇上洋广货店的旺月，不但林先生的额外支出400元指望在这时候捞回来，就是林小姐的新衣服也靠托在这几天的生意好。10点多钟。
It is the prosperous month for the rural Shenyang Guangdong store. Not only did Mr. Lin hope to get back his extra 400 yuan at this time, but Miss Lin's new clothes also depended on the good business these days. It's past 10 o'clock.
赶市的乡下人一群一群的在街上走过了，他们臂上挽着篮，或是牵着小孩子，粗声大气的一边在走，一边在谈话。他们望到了林先生的花花绿绿的铺面，都站住了，仰起脸，老婆唤丈夫。
Villagers on their way to market passed by in groups on the street. They held baskets on their arms or led children, talking loudly as they walked. When they saw Mr. Lin's colorful shop, they all stopped, raised their faces, and the wife called her husband.
孩子叫爹娘，啧啧地夸谢那些货物。新年快到了，孩子们希望穿一双新袜子，女人们想到家里的面盆早就用破，全家合用的一条面巾还是半年前的老家伙，肥皂又断绝了1个多月。
The children called them daddy and admired the goods. The new year is coming, the children hope to wear a new pair of socks, the women think that the basin at home has long been worn out, the face towel shared by the whole, the children called them daddy and admired the goods. The new year is coming, the children hope to wear a new pair of socks, the women think that the basin at home has long been worn out, the face towel shared by the whole family is still an old one from half a year ago, and the soap has been discontinued for more than a month.
趁这里卖贱货，正该买一点。林先生坐在账台上，抖擞着精神，堆起满脸的笑容，眼睛望着那些乡下人，又代销着自己铺子里的2个伙计、2个学徒，满心希望货物出去，洋钱进来。
It's time to buy some while cheap stuff is on sale here. Mr. Lin sat on the counter, energized and smiling, looking at the country people and the 2 clerks and 2 apprentices in his shop, fully hoping that the goods would go out and the foreign money would come in.
但是这些乡下人看了一会，指指点点夸谢了一会，径自懒洋洋地走到斜对门的玉昌祥铺面前站住了再看。林先生伸长了脖子，望到那般乡下人的背景，眼睛里冒出火来。
But these country people looked at it for a while, pointed and praised it for a while, and then lazily walked to Yu Chengxiang's shop across the door and stopped to look again. Mr. Lin stretched his neck and looked at the background of the country people, his eyes burning.
他恨不得拉他们回来。坐在账台后面那道分隔铺面与内宅的蝴蝶门旁边的林大娘，把勉强忍住了半晌的放出来。林小姐倚在他妈的身边，呆呆地望着街上不作声。
He couldn't wait to bring them back. Dash. Aunt Lin, who was sitting next to the butterfly door that separated the store from the inner house, behind the counter, let out the she had barely held back for a long time. Miss Lin leaned against her mother's side and stared blankly at the street without making a sound.
心头却是补补的跳，他的新衣服至少已经走脱了半件。林先生赶到柜台前，睁大了妒忌的眼睛看着斜对门的同业玉昌祥。那边的4、5个店员一字儿摆在柜台前，等候做买卖。
But her heart was pounding. She had already taken off at least half of her new clothes. Mr. Lin rushed to the counter and looked at his colleague Yu Changxiang across the door with wide jealous eyes. The 4 or 5 clerks over there were lined up in front of the counter, waiting to do business.
但是那班乡下人没有一个走进到柜台边，他们看了一会儿，又照样的走过去了。林先生觉得心头一松，忍不住望着玉昌祥的伙计笑了一笑。
But none of the country people came to the counter. They looked at it for a while and then walked over. Mr. Lin felt relieved and couldn't help but smile at Yu Changxiang's clerk.
这时，又有7、8人一队的乡下人走到林先生的铺面前，其中有一位年轻的居然上前一步，歪着头看那些挂着的阳伞。林先生猛转过脸来，一对嘴唇皮立刻吸开了。
At this time, another group of 7 or 8 country people came to Mr. Lin's shop. One of them, a young man, actually took a step forward and tilted his head to look at the hanging umbrellas. Mr. Lin suddenly turned his face and his lips parted immediately.
他亲自兜揽这位意想中的顾客了。喂，阿弟，买阳伞吗？便宜货，一只阳伞卖9角。看看货色去。一个伙计已经取下了2、3把阳伞，立刻撑开了一把，热辣辣的塞到那年轻乡下人的手里。
He personally solicited this expected customer. Hey, brother, do you want to buy an umbrella? It's a bargain. An umbrella sells for 9 cents. Let's take a look at the goods. A waiter had already taken down 2 or 3 umbrellas, opened one immediately, and thrust it into the young countryman's hand.
振起精神，使出夸卖的本领来。小当家，你看，羊缎面子，实心骨子，晴天落雨，耐用好看。9角洋钱一顶，再便宜没有了。那边是一只羊一顶，货色还没有这等好呢，你比一比就明白。
Cheer up and use your exaggeration skills. Little master, look. It has a foreign satin face and a solid frame. It can withstand sunny weather or rain. Cheer up and use your exaggeration skills. Little master, look. It has a foreign satin face and a solid frame. It can withstand sunny weather or rain. It is durable and good-looking. 90 cents a foreign dollar a hat, it couldn't be cheaper. There is a foreign currency 1 hat over there, but the quality is not as good as this one, you will understand after comparing.
那年轻的乡下人拿着伞，没有主意似的张大了嘴巴。他回过头去望着一位50多岁的老头子，又把手里的伞掂了一掂，似乎说买一把吧。老头子却老大着急地吆喝道：“阿大，你昏了。”
The young countryman held an umbrella and opened his mouth as if he had no idea. He turned back to look at an old man in his 50s, and bumped the umbrella in his hand, as if to say, "Buy one?" But the old man shouted anxiously, Ada. You fainted.
想买伞，一船硬柴，一股脑只卖了3块多钱。你娘等着2米回去吃，哪有钱来买伞？货色是便宜，没有钱买。站在那里观望的乡下人都叹着气说，懒洋洋的都走了。
I want to buy an umbrella. A boatload of firewood and an ancient brain sold for only more than 3 yuan. Your mother was waiting to measure the rice and go back to eat. How could she have the money to buy an umbrella? The goods are cheap, I don't have money to buy them. The country people standing there and watching sighed and walked away lazily.
那年轻的乡下人满脸涨红，摇一下头，放了伞也就要想走，这可把林先生急坏了，赶快让步问道：“喂，阿弟，你说多少钱呢？再看看去，货色是靠得住的，货色是便宜，钱不够。”老头一面回答。
The young countryman's face flushed, he shook his head, put down his umbrella and was about to leave. This made Mr. Lin anxious, so he quickly gave in and asked, Hey, brother, how much do you think it is? Take another look, the goods are reliable. The goods are cheap, but the money is not enough. The old man replied.
一面拉住了他的儿子，逃也似的走了。林先生苦着脸踱回到账台里，浑身不得劲儿。他知道不是自己不会做生意，委实是乡下人太穷了，买不起9毛钱的一顶伞。
He grabbed his son and ran away as if running away. Mr. Lin walked back to the counter with a grimace on his face, feeling uncomfortable all over. He knew that it wasn't that he didn't know how to do business, but that the people in the country were too poor and couldn't afford 90 cents for an umbrella.
他偷眼在望斜对门的玉昌祥，也还是只有人站在那里看，没有人上柜台买。玉昌祥左右邻的生态杂货店、万参糕饼店，那就简直连看的人都没有半个。
He glanced furtively at Yu Changxiang across the door, but there were still only people standing there watching, and no one came to the counter to buy. At the Xingtai grocery store and Wanji cake shop next door to Yu Changxiang, almost no one even looked at it.
一群一群走过的乡下人都挽着篮子，但篮子里空无一物，见或有花蓝布的衣包，看样子就知道是米。
Groups of country people passing by carried baskets on their arms, but there was nothing in the baskets. Occasionally there was a package of floral blue cloth, which looked like rice.
甚至1个多月前，乡下人收获的晚稻也早已被地主们和高利贷的债主们如数逼光。现在乡下人不得不1升2升的量着贵米吃。这一切，林先生都明白。
Even the late rice harvested by the country people more than a month ago has been exhausted by the landlords and loan sharks. Now the country people have to eat expensive rice in 1 or 2 liters. Mr. Lin understands all this.
他就觉得自己的一份生意至少是间接的被地主和高利贷者剥夺去了。时间渐渐一进正午，街上走的乡下人已经很少了，林先生的铺子就只做成了1块多钱的生意。
He felt that one of his businesses was at least indirectly deprived of him by landlords and loan sharks. The time is gradually approaching noon, and there are very few country people walking on the street. Mr. Lin's shop only does business worth more than 1 yuan.
仅仅足够开销了大廉价照码9折的红绿纸条的广告费。林先生垂头丧气走进内宅去，几乎没有勇气和女儿老婆相见。林小姐含着一泡眼泪，低着头坐在屋角。
It was just enough to cover the advertising costs of the red and green paper strips with 10% discount on big discount photos. Mr. Lin walked into the inner house dejectedly, barely having the courage to meet his daughter and wife. Miss Lin had tears in her eyes and sat in the corner of the room with her head lowered.
林大娘在一连串的打饿中挣扎着对丈夫说：“花了400块钱，又忙了1个晚上摆设起来，东洋货是准卖了，却又生意清淡，阿南的爷呀，吴妈又要拿工钱，还指半天呢，不要着急。”
Amid a series of hiccups, Aunt Lin struggled and said to her husband, "I spent 400 yuan and spent another whole night decorating it." Amid a series of hiccups, Aunt Lin struggled and said to her husband, "I spent 400 yuan and spent another whole night decorating it." Well, the Japanese goods are definitely sold, but the business is slow. Grandma, Wu Ma has to get wages again. It's only half a day. Don't be anxious.
林先生勉强安慰着，心里的难受比刀割还厉害。他闷闷地踱了几步，所有推广营业的方法都想遍了，觉得都不是路。生意清淡，早已各业如此，并不是他一家呀。人们都穷了，可没有法子。
Mr. Lin reluctantly comforted him, but the pain in his heart was worse than a knife. He took a few steps sullenly. "I have thought about all the ways to promote my business, but I feel that none of them are the way to go. Business is slow, and it has been like this for a long time in all walks of life, not just his family. People are poor, but there is nothing they can do."
但是他总还希望下午的营业能够比较好些。本镇的人家买东西大概在下午，难道他们过新年不买些东西？只要他们存心买，林先生的营业是有把握的，毕竟他的货物比别家便宜。
But he still hopes that the afternoon business can be better. People in this town probably do their shopping in the afternoon. Don't they buy something for the new year? As long as they buy with intention, Mr. Lin's business is guaranteed. After all, his goods are cheaper than others.
是这盼望使得林先生依然能够抖擞着精神坐在账台上守候他臆想中的下午的顾客。这下午照例和上午显然不同，街上并没很多的人，但几乎每个人都相识。
It is this hope that allows Mr. Lin to still sit at the counter with high energy and wait for his dream afternoon customers. This afternoon was obviously different from the morning. There were not many people on the street, but almost everyone knew each other.
都能够叫出他们的姓名，或是他们的父亲和祖父的姓名。林先生靠在柜台上，用了异常温和的眼光迎送这些慢慢地走着谈着经过他那铺面的本镇人。
They can all be called by their names, or the names of their fathers and grandfathers. Mr. Lin leaned on the counter and greeted the locals who were walking and talking slowly past his shop with unusually gentle eyes.
他时常笑嘻嘻地迎着常有交易的人喊道：“呵，程哥，到清风阁去吃茶吗？小店大放盘，交一点去。”有时被唤着的那位居然站住了，走上柜台来。
He often smiles and shouts to people who often do business. Hey, brother times, do you want to go to Qingfeng Pavilion for tea? The shop has a large display, let's do some trading. Sometimes the person being called actually stops and walks up to the counter.
于是林先生和他的店员就要大忙而特忙，异常敏感地视察着这位未可知的顾客的眼光，瞧见他的眼光瞥到什么货物上，就赶快拿出那种货物请他烤笑。
So Mr. Lin and his clerk were very busy, watching the eyes of this unknown customer very sensitively, and when they saw what goods his eyes glanced at, they quickly took out the goods and asked him to take the exam.
林小姐站在那对蝴蝶门边看望，也常常被林先生唤出来，对那位未可知的顾客叫一声伯伯。 小学徒送上一杯便茶来，外加一只小连珠。在价目上，林先生也格外让步。
Miss Lin stood by the pair of butterfly doors and was often called out by Mr. Lin to call the unknown customer uncle. The young apprentice brought a cup of tea and a small couplet of pearls. Mr. Lin also made special concessions on the price.
遇到那位顾客一定要除去1毛钱左右尾数的时候，他就从店员手里拿过那算盘来算了一会儿，然后不得已似的把那尾数从算盘上拨去，一面笑嘻嘻地说：“真不够本呐。”可是老主题。
When he met a customer who had to remove the last digit of about 10 cents, he took the abacus from the clerk's hand and counted for a while. Then he had to remove the last digit from the abacus and said with a smile, "It's really not original enough. But it's an old theme."
只好遵命了，请你多做成几笔生意吧。整个下午就是这么张罗着过去了，连现代奢大大小小居然也有10来主交易。林先生早已汗透棉袍，虽然是累得那么着，林先生心里却很愉快。
I had no choice but to obey. Please do more business. I had no choice but to obey. Please do more business. The whole afternoon went by like this. There were about 10 transactions on cash and credit, large and small. Mr. Lin had already sweated through his cotton robe. Although he was so tired, Mr. Lin felt very happy.
他冷眼偷看斜对门的玉昌祥，似乎赶不上自己铺子的热闹。常在那对蝴蝶门旁边看望的林小姐脸上也有些笑意，林大娘也少打几个饿了。快到上灯时候，林先生核算这一天的。
He glanced coldly at Yu Changxiang, who was across the door, as if he couldn't keep up with the liveliness of his shop. Miss Lin, who often looked around the pair of butterfly doors, also had a smile on her face, and Aunt Lin also had to hiccup less. When it was almost time to turn on the lights, Mr. Lin calculated the days.
流水账，上午等于0，下午卖了16元8角5分，8块钱是赊账。林先生微微一笑，但立即皱紧了眉头了。他今天的大放盘却是照本出卖，开销都没着落，管理更说不上。他呆了一会儿。
The running account was equal to 0 in the morning, and it was sold for 16 yuan and 85 cents in the afternoon, and the 8 yuan was on credit. Mr. Lin smiled slightly, but immediately frowned. His big sale today was indeed sold according to the book, and the expenses were all he had no whereabouts, let alone official benefits. He stayed for a while.
又开了账箱，取出几本账簿来翻着打了半天算盘，账上人欠的数目共有1300余元，本镇600多，四乡700多。可是欠人的客账，单是上海的东升字号就有800，合计不下2000啊。
I opened the account box again, took out several account books, flipped through them, and did some calculations for a long time. I opened the account box again, took out several account books, flipped through them, and did some calculations for a long time.
林先生低声叹一口气，觉得明天以后如果生意依然没见好，那他这年关就有点难过了。他望着玻璃窗上大放盘照码9折的红绿纸条，心里这么想，照今天那样当真放盘。
Mr. Lin sighed softly, feeling that if business is still not good after tomorrow, he will be a little sad at the end of the year. He looked at the red and green note on the glass window that read 10% off for big deals, and thought to himself, just do it like today.
生意总该会见好，亏本吗？没有生意也是照样的要开销，只好先拉些主顾来，再慢慢想法提高货码。要是四乡还有批发生意来，那就更好。突然有一个人来打断林先生的甜蜜梦想了。
Business should always be good. Is it losing money? Even if there is no business, there will still be expenses. We have to attract some customers first and then slowly try to increase the number of goods. If there is wholesale business in Xixiang, that would be even better. Suddenly someone came to interrupt Mr. Lin's sweet dream.
这是50多岁的一位老婆子，微颤颤地走进店来，手里拿着一个小小的蓝布包。林先生猛抬起头来，正和那老婆子打一个照面，想躲避也躲避不及，只好走上前去招呼她道：“朱三太。”
This was an old woman in her 50s who walked into the store tremblingly, holding a small blue cloth bag in her hand. Mr. Lin suddenly raised his head and came face to face with the old woman. He couldn't avoid it even if he wanted to, so he had to step forward and greet her, Mrs. Zhu Santa.
出来买过年东西吗？请到里面去坐坐。阿秀，来扶朱三太。林小姐早已不在那对蝴蝶门边了，没有听到。那朱三太连连摇手，就在铺面里的一张椅子上坐了，郑重地打开她的蓝布手巾包。
Are you going out to buy New Year stuff? Please come inside and sit. Axiu, come and help Mrs. Zhu. Miss Lin was no longer at the pair of butterfly doors and didn't hear it. Zhu Santai waved her hands repeatedly, sat on a chair in the shop, and solemnly opened her blue cloth handkerchief bag.
包里仅有一扣折子，他抖抖簌簌的双手捧了，直送到林先生的鼻子前。他的瘪嘴唇扭了几扭， 正想说话，林先生早已一手接过那折子，同时抢先说道：“我晓得了，明天送到你府上吧。”哦。
There was only one discount in the bag. She held it with trembling hands and brought it directly to Mr. Lin's nose. She twisted her flat lips a few times and was about to speak. Mr. Lin had already taken the discount with one hand and said first at the same time. I understand. I'll deliver it to your house tomorrow. Oh.
10月、11月、12月，一总是3个月，33得9是9块吧？明天你送来。哦，不要送，让我带了去。朱三太扭着他的瘪嘴唇，很艰难似的说：“他有300元的老本存在林先生的铺里。”
October, November, December. 1 is always 3 months. 3 is 9. Is it $9? You will deliver it tomorrow? Oh, don't give it away. Let me take it. Mrs. Zhu twisted her pursed lips and said with difficulty. She has 300 yuan of old capital stored in Mr. Lin's shop.
按月来取3块钱的利息，可是最近林先生却拖欠了3个月，原说是到了年底总付，明天是送灶日，老婆子要买送灶的东西，所以亲自上林先生的铺子来了。
I come to collect 3 yuan of interest every month, but recently Mr. Lin has been in arrears for 3 months. It was originally said that the lump sum would be paid at the end of the year. Tomorrow is the stove gift day. The old lady wanted to buy things for the stove, so she came to Mr. Lin's shop in person.
看他那股扭起了一对瘪嘴唇的劲儿，光景是钱不到手就一定不肯走。林先生抓着头皮不作声。这9块钱的利息，他何尝存心白赖？只是3个月来生意清淡，每天卖得的钱仅够开伙食。
Judging from the way she twisted her pouty lips, she was definitely not willing to leave until she got the money. Mr. Lin scratched his scalp and remained silent. He had no intention of wasting the 9 yuan in interest, but his business had been slow for 3 months, and he only made enough money from his daily sales to buy food.
付捐税不知不觉地拖欠下来了。然而今天要是不付，这老婆子也许会就在铺面上嚷闹，那就太丢脸，对于营业的前途很有影响。好，带了去吧。林先生终于斗气似的说。
Pay taxes and duties, and unknowingly fell into arrears. However, if I don't pay today, the old woman might make a fuss in the shop, which would be too embarrassing and have a great impact on the future of the business. Okay, take it with you. Mr. Lin finally said vindicatively.
声音有点哽咽。他跑到账台里，把上下午卖得的现钱归并起来，又从腰包里掏出一个双毫，这才凑成了8块大洋、10角小洋、40个铜子，交付了朱三太。
The voice was a little choked. He ran to the account counter, combined the cash from the morning and afternoon sales, and took out a pair of cents from his pocket. Then he made up the sum of 8 yuan, 10 jiao, and 40 coppers, and handed them to Mrs. Zhu Santai.
当他看见那老婆子把这些银洋铜子郑重地数了又数，而且抖抖簌簌地放在那蓝布手巾上包了起来的时候，他忍不住叹一口气，异想天开地打算拉回几文来。他勉强笑着说：“三阿太。”
When he saw the old woman solemnly counting the silver coins and wrapping them up in the blue cloth handkerchief, he couldn't help but sigh and whimsically planned to get back a few coins. Come, he forced a smile and said. 3 antai.
你这蓝布手巾太旧了，买一块老牌麻纱白手帕去吧。我们有上好的洗脸手巾、肥皂，买一点去新年里用吧。价钱公道。不要，老太婆了，用不到。朱三太连连摆手说。
Your blue cloth handkerchief is too old. Why don't you buy an old-fashioned linen white handkerchief? We have good hand towels and soap. Buy some to use in the new year. The price is fair. No, I'm an old woman, I don't need it. Zhu Santai waved his hands repeatedly and said.
把折子藏在衣袋里，捧着他的蓝布手巾包径自去了。林先生哭丧着脸走回内宅去，因着朱三太的上门讨利息，他记起还有2注存款，桥头陈老七的200元和张寡妇的150元。
He hid the fold in his pocket and walked away holding her blue cloth handkerchief. Mr. Lin walked back to the inner house with a sad face. Because Mrs. Zhu Santa came to ask for interest, he remembered that he still had 2 deposits, 200 yuan from Quoto Chen Laochi and 150 yuan from Widow Zhang.
总共10来块钱的利息都是不便拖欠的，总得先期送去。他抡着指头算日子，24、25、26到26，放在4箱的账头，该可以收起了。店里的寿生是前天出去收账的。
A total of about 10 yuan in interest was inconveniently owed and had to be sent in advance. He counted the days with his fingers, 24, 25, 26. By the 26th, all the accounts left in Xixiang should be collected. The Shousheng in the store went out to collect the accounts the day before yesterday.
劫持是26应该回来了， 本镇的账头总得到28、9方才有个数目。然而上海浩家的收账客人说不定明后天就会到，只有再向恒源钱庄去借了。但是明天的门市怎样？
At the end of the day, 26 should be back. The town's accounts must be 28.9 before they have a number. However, the debt collector from Shanghai Haojia might arrive tomorrow or the day after tomorrow, so the only option is to borrow money from Hengyuan Bank. But what will the store sales be like tomorrow?
他这么低着头一边走一边想，猛听的女儿的声音在他耳边说：“爸爸，你看这块大绸好吗？7尺4块2角，不贵吧？”林先生心里蓦地一跳，站住了，睁大着眼睛说不出话。
As he walked with his head lowered, thinking, he suddenly heard his daughter's voice saying in his ear, Dad, what do you think of this big piece of silk? It's 7 feet, 4 yuan and 2 cents, isn't it expensive? Mr. Lin's heart suddenly jumped and he stood still with his eyes wide open and speechless.
林小姐手里托着那块绸，却在那里憨笑。4块2角，数目可真不算大。然而今天店里总共只卖的16块多，并且是老师照本贱卖的啊！林先生怔了一会儿，这才没精打采地问道。
Miss Lin was holding the piece of silk in her hand, but she was smiling innocently. $4.02. The amount is really not that big, but today the total price in the store was just over 16 yuan, and it was honestly sold at a low price. Mr. Lin was stunned for a while, and then asked listlessly.
你哪来的钱呢？挂在账上。林先生听得又是欠账，忍不住皱一下眉头。但女儿是自己宠惯了的，林大娘又抵死偏护着，林先生没奈何，只有苦笑。过一会儿，他叹一口气，轻轻埋怨道：
Where did you get the money? Put it on the account. When Mr. Lin heard that he was in debt again, he couldn't help but frown. But he was used to doting on his daughter, and Mrs. Lin protected her to the death. Mr. Lin had no choice but to smile bitterly. After a while, he sighed and complained softly.
那么性急，过了年再买岂不是好？饭。又过了2天，大放盘的林先生的铺子生意果然很好，每天可以做30多元的生意了。林大娘的打饿大大减少，平均是5分钟来一次。
So impatient. Wouldn't it be better to buy it after the Chinese New Year? 3. 2 days later, Mr. Lin's shop, which had a big sale, was doing very well. It could do more than 30 yuan of business a day. Mrs. Lin's hiccups were greatly reduced, with an average of it comes every 5 minutes.
林小姐在铺面和内宅之间跳进跳出，脸上红喷喷的，时常在笑，有时竟在铺面帮忙招呼生意，直到林大娘再三唤她，方才跑进去，一边擦着额上的汗珠，一边兴冲冲的几口说：“妈呀！”
Miss Lin jumped in and out between the shop and the inner house. Her face was red and she was always smiling. Sometimes she would help greet business in the shop. It wasn't until Mrs. Lin called her again and again that she ran in, wiping the sweat on her forehead. Zhu, while excitedly said in a hurry, Mom.
又叫我进来干嘛？我不觉得辛苦呀。妈，爸爸累得满身是汗，嗓子也喊哑了。刚才一个客人买了5块钱东西呢。妈，不要怕我辛苦，不要怕。爸爸叫我歇一会儿就出去呢。林大娘只是点头。
Why did you ask me to come in again? I don't feel like it's hard. Mom. Dad was so tired that he was covered in sweat and his voice was hoarse. A customer just bought something for 5 yuan. Mom. Don't be afraid of my hard work, don't be afraid. Dad told me to rest for a while and then go out. Mrs. Lin just nodded.
打一个饿就念一声大慈大悲菩萨。客厅里本就供奉着一尊慈观音，点着一炷香，林大娘就摇摇摆摆走过去磕头，谢菩萨的保佑，还要祷告菩萨一发慈悲，保佑林先生的生意永远那么好。
When you say, great merciful and great compassionate Bodhisattva. There was already a porcelain guanyin enshrined in the living room, and a stick of incense was lit. When you say, great merciful and great compassionate Bodhisattva. There was already a porcelain guanyin enshrined in the living room, and a stick of incense was lit. Mrs. Lin waddled over and kowtowed, thanking the Bodhisattva for his blessing, and praying that the Bodhisattva would show mercy and bless Mr. Lin's business to always be so good.
保佑林小姐一长一大，明年就得个好女婿。但是在铺面张罗的林先生虽然打起精神做生意，脸上笑容不断，心里却像有几根线牵着。每逢卖得了1块钱，看见顾客欣然携着纸包而去。
May Miss Lin grow up easily and get a good son-in-law next year. However, although Mr. Lin was busy doing business in the shop and kept smiling on his face, he felt like there were a few threads pulling him in his heart. Every time I get $1 from the sale, I see customers happily leaving with paper bags in hand.
林先生就忍不住心里一顿，在他心里的算盘上就加添了5分洋钱的血本的亏舍。 他几次想把这个大放盘时每块钱的十足亏折算成3分，可是无论如何算来算去总得5分。
Mr. Lin couldn't help but feel sad, and added the loss of 5 cents of capital to his mental calculation. He tried several times to calculate the actual loss of every dollar in this big sale into 3 points, but no matter what, he always came up with 5 points.
生意虽然好，他却越卖越心疼了。在柜台上招呼主顾的时候，他这种矛盾的心理有时竟至几乎使他发晕。偶尔他偷眼望望斜对门的玉昌祥，就觉得那边闲立在柜台边的店员和掌柜。
Although business was good, the more he sold, the more distressed he became. When greeting customers at the counter, his ambivalence sometimes almost made him dizzy. Occasionally, he glanced at Yu Changxiang across the door, and felt that the clerk and shopkeeper were standing idle at the counter.
嘴角上都带着讥讽的讪笑，似乎都在说：“看这姓林的傻子呀，当真亏本放盘啊！看着吧，他的生意越好，就越亏本，倒闭的越快。”那时候，林先生便咬一下嘴唇。
There was a sarcastic smile on the corners of their mouths, as if they were saying, "Look at this fool surnamed Lin, he is really selling at a loss. Just look at it, the better his business is, the more money he will lose and the faster he will go bankrupt." At that time, Mr. Lin bit his lip.
决定明天无论如何要把货码提高，要把次等货标上头等货的价格。给林先生斡旋那封存东洋货问题的商会长，当走过林家铺子的时候，也微微笑着站住了，对林先生贺喜。
Decided to raise the goods code tomorrow no matter what, and mark second-class goods with the price of first-class goods. The president of the Chamber of Commerce, who was mediating the issue of sealing up Japanese goods for Mr. Lin, also smiled slightly and stopped to congratulate Mr. Lin when he passed by Lin's shop.
并且拍着林先生的肩膀，轻声说：“如何？400块钱是花的不冤枉吧？可是卜局长那边你也得稍稍点缀，防他看得眼红，也要来敲诈。生意好，妒忌的人就多，就是卜局长不生心。”
And patted Mr. Lin on the shoulder and said softly, "How about it? 400 yuan is not wasted. But you have to embellish Director Bu a little bit to prevent him from getting jealous and trying to blackmail you. If business is good, there will be more jealous people. That is, Director Bu is not angry." And patted Mr. Lin on the shoulder and said softly, "How about it? 400 yuan is not wasted. But you have to embellish Director Bu a little bit to prevent him from getting jealous and trying to blackmail you. If business is good, there will be more jealous people. That is, Director Bu is not angry."
他们也要去挑拨呀！林先生谢商会长的关切，心里老大吃惊，几乎连做生意都没有精神。然而最使他心神不宁的是，店里的寿生出去收账到现在还没有回来。
They are going to stir up trouble too. Mr. Lin thanked the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce for his concern. He was so surprised that he almost had no energy to do business. They are going to stir up trouble too. Mr. Lin thanked the chairman of the Chamber of Commerce for his concern. He was so surprised that he almost had no energy to do business. But what made him most uneasy was that Shouxing in the store had gone out to collect the bill and had not returned yet.
林先生是等着寿生收的钱来开销客账。上海东升字号的收账客人前天早已到镇，直催逼的林先生再没有话语之无了。如果寿生再不来，林先生只有向恒源钱庄借款的一法。这一来
Mr. Lin was waiting for the money collected by Shouxing to pay his customer account. The bill collector from Shanghai Dongxing brand had already arrived in town the day before yesterday, and he was so pressed that Mr. Lin could no longer falter. If Shouxing never comes again, Mr. Lin's only option is to borrow money from Hengyuan Bank.
林先生又将多负担50-60元的利息，这在见天亏本的林先生委实比割肉还心疼。到4点钟光景，林先生忽然听得街上走过的人们乱哄哄的在议论着什么，人们的脸色都很黄急。
Mr. Lin will have to bear an additional 50 or 60 yuan in interest. This is really more distressing for Mr. Lin, who is losing money than having his flesh cut off. At 4 o'clock, Mr. Lin suddenly heard people walking by on the street talking about something, and their faces were all anxious.
似乎发生了什么大事情了。一心惦念着出去收账的寿生是否平安的林先生，就以为一定是快班船遭了强盗抢，他的心补补的乱跳。他唤住了一个路人，焦急地问道：“什么事？”
It seems like something big happened. Mr. Lin, who was worried about the safety of Shouxing who was out to collect the bill, thought that the express boat must have been robbed by robbers, and his heart was beating wildly. He called a passerby and asked anxiously, "What's up?"
是不是立式快班遭了强盗抢？哦，又是强盗抢吗？路上真不太平。抢还是小事，还要保人去哪？那人有名的闲汉陆和尚含糊地回答，同时闪着半只眼睛看林先生铺子里花花绿绿的货物。
Was the Lisher Express train robbed by robbers? Oh. Was it another robbery? The road is really uneven. Robbery is a trivial matter, but why do you want to kidnap someone? The man, the famous Xianhan monk Lu, answered vaguely, while staring at the colorful goods in Mr. Lin's shop with half an eye.
林先生不得要领，心里更急，丢开陆和尚，就去问第二个走进来的人，桥头的王三毛。听说历史班遭抢，当真吗？那一定是太保阿叔手下人干的。太保阿叔是枪毙了，他的手下人多么厉害！
Mr. Lin couldn't figure it out and became even more anxious. He left Monk Lu alone and went to ask the second person who approached, Wang Sanmao at the bridge. I heard that Li Shi's class was robbed. Are you serious? That must have been done by Taibao Ashu's men. Taibao Ashu was shot. How powerful his men were.
王三毛一边回答，一边只顾走。可是林先生却急坏了，冷汗从额角上钻出来。他早就估量到寿生一定是今天回来，而且是从立誓收账程序中预定的最后一处坐快班船回来。
Wang Sanmao answered and just walked away. But Mr. Lin was so anxious that cold sweat broke out on his forehead. He had already estimated that Shouxing would come back today, and he would take a fast boat from Li Shi, the last place scheduled for the collection process.
此刻已是4点钟，不见他来，王三毛又是那样说，那还有什么疑义吗？林先生竟忘记了这所谓历史班遭强盗抢乃是自己的发明了。他满脸急汗，直往内宅跑，在那对蝴蝶门边忘记跨门槛。
It's already 4 o'clock now. He hasn't come yet. Wang Sanmao said that again. Is there any doubt? Mr. Lin actually forgot that the so-called Li Shi class was robbed by robbers was his own invention. With sweat on his face, he ran straight to the inner house. He forgot to cross the threshold of the pair of butterfly doors.
几乎绊了一跤。爸爸，上海打仗了，东洋兵放炸弹烧闸北。林小姐大叫着跑到林先生跟前。林先生怔了一下，什么上海打仗，原就和他不相干，但中间既然牵连着东洋兵。
Almost stumbled. Dad. There's a war in Shanghai. Japanese soldiers set bombs to burn Jabei. Miss Lin shouted and ran to Mr. Lin. Mr. Lin was startled. The battle in Shanghai had nothing to do with him in the first place, but since the Japanese soldiers were involved.
又好像不能不追问一声了。他看着女儿的很兴奋的脸孔问道：“东洋兵放炸弹吗？你从哪里听来的？”街上走过的人全是那么说。东洋兵放大炮，制炸弹，闸北烧光了。哦，那么
It seemed like I had to ask more questions. He looked at his daughter's excited face and asked, Did the Japanese soldiers set off bombs? Where did you hear that? That's what everyone passing by on the street said. The Japanese soldiers fired artillery and threw bombs. Jabei was burned down. Oh, then.
有人说历史快班强盗抢吗？林小姐摇头，就像扑火的灯蛾似的扑向外面去了。林先生迟疑了一会儿，站在那蝴蝶门边抓头皮。林大娘在里面打饿，又是喃喃的祷告，菩萨保佑。
Did anyone say that Li Shi Kuaiban was robbed by robbers? Miss Lin shook her head and rushed outside like a moth to a flame. Mr. Lin hesitated for a while, then stood by the butterfly door and scratched his scalp. Aunt Lin hiccuped inside and murmured again. Prayer, Bodhisattva bless you.
炸弹不要落到我们头上来。林先生转身再到铺子里，却见女儿和2个店员正在谈得很热闹。对门生态杂货店里的老板金老虎也站在柜台外边指手画脚的讲谈。上海打仗。
Don't let the bomb fall on our heads. Mr. Lin turned around and went back to the shop, only to see his daughter and 2 clerks having a lively conversation. Jean Huahu, the owner of Xingtai grocery store opposite, was also standing outside the counter gesticulating and talking. The war in Shanghai.
东洋飞机制炸弹烧了闸北，上海已经罢市，全都证实了。强盗抢快班船吗？没有听人说起过啊。历史快班吗？早已到了，一路平安。金老虎看见那快班船上的伙计刚刚背着2个蒲包走过的。
The Oriental planes dropped bombs and burned down Jabei, and there was a market strike in Shanghai, which was all confirmed. Do robbers rob express ships? I've never heard anyone mention it. Is there an express bus from Li Shi? We've arrived a long time ago. Have a safe journey. Golden Tiger saw the man on the express boat passing by carrying 2 cattail bags just now.
林先生心里松一口气，知道寿生今天又没回来，但也知道好好的没有逢到强盗抢。现在是满街都在议论上海的战事了。小伙计们夹在闹里骂东洋乌龟，竟也有人当街大呼。
Mr. Lin felt relieved, knowing that Shouxing did not come back today, but he also knew that he had not been robbed by robbers. Now the streets are full of talk about the war in Shanghai. The boys were in the middle of the commotion and yelled, Oriental turtle, Some people actually shouted in the street.
再买东洋货就是网吧。林小姐听着，脸上就绯红了一大片。林先生却还不动神色。大家都卖东洋货，并且大家花了几百块钱以后，都已经奉着特许，只要把东洋商标撕去了就行。
If you buy Japanese goods again, you will be forgetful. Miss Lin's face turned red as she listened. Mr. Lin, however, remained calm. Everyone was selling Japanese goods, and after spending hundreds of dollars, they all had a license. Just tear off the Japanese trademarks. Just go.
他现在满店的货物都已经称为国货，买主们也都是国货，国货的说着就拿走了。在此满街人人为了上海的战事而没有心思想到生意的时候，林先生始终在愁虑他的正事。
All the goods in his store are now called domestic products, and the buyers all say, domestic products, and take them away. While everyone on the street was busy with the war in Shanghai and no longer thought about business, Mr. Lin was always thinking about his business.
他还是不肯花重力去借庄款，他去和上海浩家的收账客人情商，请他再多等这么1天2天。他的售声极迟，明天傍晚总该会到。林老板，你也是明白人，怎么说出这种话来呀
？He still refused to spend a lot of money to borrow money from the bank, so he went to talk to the bill collector from Shanghai Hao family and asked him to wait for another day or two. His birthday will arrive as late as tomorrow evening. Boss Lin, you are also a sensible person. How could you say such a thing?
现在上海开了火，说不定明后天火车就不通，我是巴不得今晚上就动身呢。怎么再等1-2天？请你今天把账款缴清，明天一早我好走。我也是吃人家的饭，请你照顾照顾吧。
Now that Shanghai is on fire, trains may not be available tomorrow or the day after tomorrow. I really want to leave tonight. Why wait another day or two? Please pay the account in full today so that I can leave early tomorrow morning. I also eat other people's food. Please take care of me.
上海客人毫无通融地拒绝了林先生的情商。林先生看来是无可商量了，只好忍痛去到恒源钱庄去商借。他还恐怕那钱猢狲知道他是急用，要趁火打劫，高抬利息。
The Shanghai guest rejected Mr. Lin's emotional intelligence without mercy. Mr. Lin seemed to be unable to negotiate, so he had no choice but to go to Hengyuan Bank to negotiate a loan. He was also afraid that the money monkey would know that he was in urgent need of money and would take advantage of it to rob him and raise the interest rate.
谁知钱庄经理的口气却完全不对了。那老病鬼经理听完了林先生的申请，并没作答，只管捧着他那老古董的水烟筒补落落的呼，直到烧完一根纸吹，这才慢吞吞地说：“不行了。”
Unexpectedly, the bank manager's tone was completely wrong. After listening to Mr. Lin's application, the consumptive manager didn't answer. He just held his antique hookah and blew it until he finished burning a piece of paper and then said slowly, "No more."
东洋兵开仗，上海罢市，银行钱庄都封关，知道他们几时弄得好。上海这路一段，毕庄就成了磨脚蟹，绘画不通，比尊处再好的户头也只好不做了。对不起，实在爱莫能助。林先生呆了一呆。
The Japanese soldiers started a war, the Shanghai market went on strike, and the banks were closed. You know when they will get it right. Once the road to Shanghai was cut off, our village became a crab without legs, and the bank transfers were blocked. No matter how good the account was at Bizunchu, we had no choice but to give it up. Sorry, I really can't help. The Japanese soldiers started a war, the Shanghai market went on strike, and the banks were closed. You know when they will get it right. Once the road to Shanghai was cut off, our village became a crab without legs, and the bank transfers were blocked.
还总以为这痨病鬼经理故意刁难，无非是为提高利息做地步，正想结结实实说几句恳求的话，却不料那经理又逼进一步道：“刚才壁咚吩咐过，他得的信，这次的乱子恐怕要闹大。”
I always thought that this consumptive manager was deliberately making things difficult, just to increase the interest rate. I was about to say a few words of pleading, but unexpectedly, the manager pushed a step further and said, "We just gave the order, and with the letter he got, I'm afraid the trouble will be big this time."
叫我们收紧盘子。尊处原欠500，22那天又是100，总共是600。年关前总得扫数归清，我们也算是老主顾，今天先透一个信，免得临时多费口舌，大家面子上难为情。哦。
Tell us to tighten our plates. I originally owed 500, and on the 22nd, I owed another 100, for a total of 600. We must pay it all before the end of the year. We are also regular customers, so today we will send you a letter, so as not to waste time and save everyone's face. Embarrassed. O.
可是小店里也实在为难，要看账头收的怎样。林先生呆了半晌，这才纳出这2句话：“嘿，何必客气， 宝号里这几天来的生意比重不同，区600块钱还为难吗？今天是同老兄说明白了。
But it's really difficult in the small shop. It depends on how the accounts are collected. Mr. Lin was stunned for a long time, and then he said these two sentences. Hey. Why be so polite? The business in Baohao in the past few days has been extraordinary. It's only 600 yuan. Is it still embarrassing? I made it clear to my brother today.
总望扫树归清，我在壁咚跟前好交代。痨病鬼经理冷冷地说：“站起来了。”林先生冷了半截身子，瞧情形是万难挽回，只好硬着头皮走出了那家钱庄。
I hope everything will be cleared up, so I can explain it to you in front of me. The tuberculosis ghost manager said coldly and stood up. Mr. Lin was half cold. Seeing that the situation was irreversible, he had no choice but to bite the bullet and walked out of the bank.
他此时这才明白，原来远在上海的打仗也要影响到他的小铺子了。今年的年关当真是难过，上海的收账客人力逼着要钱，恒源里不许当过年，寿生还没回来，知道他怎样了，镇上的账头。
Only then did he realize that the war in Shanghai would also affect his small shop. This year's New Year's Eve is really sad. The debt collectors in Shanghai are pressing for money. Heng Yuan is not allowed to stay for the new year. Shousheng hasn't come back yet. I know what happened to him, the town's accounts.
去年只收起80%，今年瞧来连80%都捏不稳，横在他前面的路只是一条暂停营业、清理账目，而这条路也就等于破产。他这铺子里早已没有自己的资本，一旦清理，剩给他的。
Last year he only collected 80%, but this year it seems that even 80% is not secure. The road ahead of him is just one: suspend business and clean up the accounts. And this road is equivalent to bankruptcy. He has no capital of his own in this shop. Once it is liquidated, what will be left for him?
光景只有一家3口，3个光身子。林先生愈想愈仄，走过那座望仙桥时，他看着桥下的浑水，几乎想纵身一跳完事。可是有一个人在背后唤他道：“林先生，上海打仗了，是真的吧？”
The situation was just a family of 3 and 3 naked people. The more Mr. Lin thought about it, the more he became confused. When he walked across the Wangxian Bridge, he looked at the muddy water under the bridge and almost wanted to jump. But there was a person calling him from behind. Mr. Lin, is it true that there is a war in Shanghai?
听说东栅外刚刚调来了一支兵，到商会里要借饷，开口就是2万，商会里正在开会呢。林先生急回过脸去看，原来正是那位存有200块钱在他铺子里的陈老七。
I heard that a troop of soldiers had just been transferred from outside Dongjia, and they went to the Chamber of Commerce to ask for their pay. The asking price was 20,000 yuan. There was a meeting in the Chamber of Commerce. Mr. Lin hurriedly turned around and saw that it was Chen Laoqi who had saved 200 yuan in his shop.
也是林先生的一位债主。哦，林先生打一个冷噤，只回答了这一声，就赶快下桥，一口气跑回家去。4. 这晚上的夜饭，林大娘在家常的1荤2素以外，特又添了一个碟子。
He is also one of Mr. Lin's creditors. Oh. Mr. Lin froze for a moment, only answered this, then quickly got off the bridge and ran home in one breath. 4. For dinner this evening, in addition to the usual meat and vegetables, Mrs. Lin also added an extra plate.
是到八仙楼买来的红焖肉，林先生心爱的东西。另外又有1斤黄酒。林小姐笑不离口，为的铺子里生意好，为的大绸新旗袍已经做成，也为的上海竟然开火打东洋人。
It's the braised pork bought at Baxiamo, Mr. Lin's favorite thing. There is also a pound of rice wine. Miss Lin couldn't stop laughing, because the shop was doing well, because the new silk cheongsam had been made, and because Shanghai actually opened fire on the Japanese.
林大娘打饿的次数更加少了，差不多10分钟只来一回。只有林先生心里发闷到要死。他喝着闷酒，看看女儿，又看看老婆，几次想把那炸弹式的恶消息宣布，然而终于没有那样的勇气。
Aunt Lin's hiccups became even less frequent, coming only once every 10 minutes. Only Mr. Lin felt depressed to death. He drank sullenly, looked at his daughter, and then at his wife. He wanted to announce the bad news like a bomb several times, but finally did not have the courage.
并且他还不曾绝望，还想挣扎，至少是还想掩饰他的2下里碰不到头。所以当商会里议决了答应借饷5000，并且要林先生摊任20元的时候，他毫不推脱就答应下来了。
And he wasn't desperate yet, he still wanted to struggle, at least to cover up that he couldn't hit his head in 2 strokes. So when the Chamber of Commerce agreed to borrow 5,000 yuan and asked Mr. Lin to contribute 20 yuan, he agreed without any hesitation.
他决定非到最后5分钟不让老婆和女儿知道那家道困难的真实情形。他的划算是这样的，人家欠他的账收一个80%吧，他还人家的账也是个80%， 反正可以借口上海打仗，钱装不通。
He decided not to let his wife and daughter know the true situation of the family's financial difficulties until the last 5 minutes. His bargain was this: he would charge 80% of the debt owed to him, and he would pay 80% of the debt owed to him anyway. He could use the excuse that there was a war in Shanghai and the banks were blocked.
为难的是人欠我欠之间尚差600光景，那只有用剜肉补疮的方法，拼命放盘卖贱货，且捞几个钱来度过了眼前再说。这年头谁能够顾到将来呢？眼前得过且过，是这么想定了方法。
The embarrassing thing is that there is still a gap of 600 years between what I owe and what I owe, so I can only use the method of cutting out flesh to mend the sores and sell cheap stuff, and make a few money to get by. Who can take care of the future these days? Muddling along for the moment. That's how I figured it out.
又加上那一斤黄酒的力量，林先生倒酣睡了一夜，噩梦也没有半个。第二天早上，林先生醒来时已经是6点半钟，天色很阴沉。林先生觉得有点头晕，他匆匆忙忙吞进2碗稀饭。
Coupled with the power of the pound of rice wine, Mr. Lin slept soundly all night without any nightmares. The next morning, coupled with the power of the pound of rice wine, Mr. Lin slept soundly all night without any nightmares. The next morning, it was already 6:30 when Mr. Lin woke up, and the sky was very gloomy. Mr. Lin felt a little dizzy. He hurriedly swallowed 2 bowls of porridge.
就到铺子里，一眼就看见那位上海客人板起了脸孔，在那里做手回话。而尤其叫林先生猛吃一惊的是，斜对门的玉昌祥也贴起红红绿绿的纸条，也在那里大放盘照码9折了。
As soon as I got to the shop, I saw the Shanghainese customer sitting there with a serious face and answering questions. What particularly surprised Mr. Lin was that Yu Changxiang, diagonally across the door, also posted a red and green note, offering a 10% off discount on large sales.
林先生昨夜想好的如意算盘，立刻被斜对门那些红绿纸条冲一个摇摇不定。林老板，你真是开玩笑！昨晚上不给我回音，轮船是8点钟开，我还得转乘火车，8点钟这班船我是非走不行。
Mr. Lin's wishful thinking last night was immediately shaken by the red and green notes diagonally across the door. Boss Lin, you are really joking. You didn't reply to me last night. The ship leaves at 8 o'clock, and I have to transfer to the train. I have to take the 8 o'clock ship.
请你快点！上海客人不耐烦地说，把一个拳头在桌子上一放。林先生只有赔不是，请他原谅，实在是因为上海打仗钱装不通，彼此是多年的老主顾，务请格外看成。那么叫我空手回去吗？
Please hurry up. The Shanghai guest said impatiently and put his fist on the table. Mr. Lin can only accompany you. Please forgive him. It is because the bank in Shanghai is not connected, and both of them have been regular customers for many years. Please pay special attention to Cheng. You want me to go back empty-handed?
这断乎不会。我们的寿生意回来，有多少付多少，我要是藏落半个钱，不是人。林先生颤着声音说，努力忍住了滚到眼眶边的眼泪。话是说到尽头了，上海客人只好不再啰嗦。
This definitely won't happen. As soon as our longevity student comes back, he will pay as much as he has. If I hide half of the money, I am not a human being. Mr. Lin said with a trembling voice, trying hard to hold back the tears rolling to his eyes. At the end of his words, the Shanghai guest had no choice but to stop talking.
可是他坐在那里不肯走。林先生急得什么似的，心是补补的乱跳。今年他虽然万分拮据，面子上可还遮得过，现在摆一个人在铺子里做手，这件事要是传扬开去，他的信用可就完了。
But he sat there and refused to leave. Mr. Lin seemed anxious, and his heart was beating wildly. Although he has been extremely poor in recent years, he has been able to keep up his reputation. Now that he has a person sitting in the shop, if this matter spreads, his credibility will be ruined.
他的债户还多着呢，万一群起效尤，他这铺子只好立刻关门。他在没有办法中想办法，几次请这位讨账客人到内宅去做，然而讨账客人不肯。天又索地下启动雨来了。
He still has a lot of debtors, and if others follow suit, his shop will have to close down immediately. He thought of a way out of his desperation and invited the debt collector to sit in his inner house several times, but the debt collector refused. Freezing rain fell again.
一条街上冷清清的，简直没有人行。自有这条街以来，从没见过这样萧索的腊尾岁镜。朔风吹着那些招牌，擦擦的响。渐渐的，冻雨又有变成雪花的模样。
One street was deserted and almost deserted. Since the establishment of this street, I have never seen such a desolate end of the year. The early wind blew the signboards, making a rustling sound. Gradually the freezing rain turned into snowflakes again.
沿街店铺里的伙计们靠在柜台上扬起了脸发怔。 林先生和那位收账客人有一句没一句的闲谈着。林小姐忽然走出蝴蝶门来，站在街边看那锁锁的洞宇。
The guys in the shops along the street leaned on the counter and raised their faces in confusion. Mr. Lin and the bill collector chatted without a word. Miss Lin suddenly walked out of the butterfly door and stood on the street looking at the freezing rain.
从蝴蝶门后送来的林大娘的的声音又渐渐加紧。林先生嘴里应酬着，一边看看女儿，又听听老婆的打心里一阵一阵酸上来，想起她的一生简直毫没幸福。
Aunt Lin's hiccups, which came from behind the butterfly door, gradually became louder and louder. Mr. Lin was socializing while looking at his daughter and listening to his wife's hiccups. His heart felt sour for a while, thinking that his life was completely unhappy.
然而又不知道坑害他到这地步的究竟是谁。那位上海客人似乎气平了一些了，忽然很恳切地说：“林老板，你是个好人，一点嗜好都没有，做生意很巴结认真。放在20年前，你怕不发财吗？”
However, he didn't know who it was that had tricked him to this extent. The Shanghai guest seemed to have calmed down a bit, and suddenly said sincerely, "Boss Lin, you are a good person. You have no hobbies at all, and you are very flattering and serious in doing business. 20 years ago, were you afraid that you would not get rich?"
可是现今时事不同，捐税重，开销大，生意又轻，混得过也还是你的本事。林先生叹一口气，苦笑着，算是谦逊。上海客人顿了一顿，又接着说下去。贵镇上的市面今年又比上年差些。
But the current situation is different. Taxes are heavy, expenses are high, and business is clean. It's still up to you to get by. But the current situation is different. Taxes are heavy, expenses are high, and business is clean. It's still up to you to get by. Mr. Lin sighed and smiled bitterly, which was considered modest. The Shanghai guest paused, and then continued. The market in your town is worse this year than last year.
是不是？内地全靠箱装生意，乡下人太穷，真是没有法子呀。9点钟了，怎么你们的收账伙计还没来呢？这个人靠得住吗？林先生心里一跳，暂时回答不出来。虽然是7、8年的老伙计。
Yes or no? The mainland relies entirely on village business, and the country people are so poor that they really have no choice. Oh, it's 9 o'clock. Why hasn't your bill collection guy arrived yet? Is this person reliable? Mr. Lin's heart skipped a beat and he couldn't answer for the time being. Although he is an old friend of 7 or 8 years.
一向没有出过岔子，但谁能保到底呢？何况又是过期不见回来。上海客人看着林先生那迟疑的神气，就笑，那笑声有几分异样。忽然那边林小姐转脸对林先生急促地叫道：“爸爸。”
Nothing has ever gone wrong, but who can guarantee the end? What's more, he didn't come back after the expiration date. The Shanghai guests looked at Mr. Lin's hesitant look and laughed. The laughter was a bit strange. Suddenly Miss Lin over there turned to Mr. Lin and shouted hurriedly, "Dad!"
寿生回来了，一身泥。显然林小姐的叫声也是一样的。林先生跳起来，又惊又喜，着急的想跑到柜台前去看，可是心慌了，两腿发软。这时寿生已经跑了进来，当真是一身泥。
Shoshing is back. Covered in mud. Apparently Miss Lin's cry was also strange. Mr. Lin jumped up, surprised and happy, and wanted to run to the counter anxiously to take a look, but he panicked and his legs became weak. At this time, Shoshing had already ran in. Shoshing is back. Covered in mud. Apparently Miss Lin's cry was also strange. Mr. Lin jumped up, surprised and happy, and wanted to run to the counter anxiously to take a look, but he panicked and his legs became weak. At this time, Shoshing had already ran in, really covered in mud.
气喘喘地坐下了，说不出话来。林先生估量那情形不对，吓得没有主意，也不开口。上海客人在旁边皱眉头。过了一会儿，寿生方才喘着气说：“好险呀，差一些被他们抓住了。”
He sat down panting, speechless. Mr. Lin guessed that something was wrong, so he was so frightened that he had no idea and did not speak. The Shanghai guests frowned nearby. After a while, Shoshing gasped and said, "Dash. It's so dangerous. I almost got caught by them."
到底是强盗抢了快班船吗？林先生惊急，心一横，倒逼出话来了：“不是强盗，是兵队拉夫呀！昨天下午赶不上乘快班，今天一早乘航船，哪里知道航船听到这里要捉船，就停在东栅外了。”
Did the robbers rob the express boat? Mr. Lin was so shocked that he was so heartbroken that he was forced to speak. It's not a robber. It's the Army RAF. I couldn't catch the express class yesterday afternoon. I took advantage of the boat early this morning, but I didn't know that the boat heard that there was a plan to capture the boat, so it stopped outside the east gate.
我上岸走不到半里路，就碰到拉夫、西面宝祥衣庄的阿毛被他们拉去了。我跑得快，抄小路逃了回来。他妈的，性命交关！寿生一面说，一面撩起衣服。
I walked ashore less than half a mile when I met Raf. A Mayo from Baoxiang clothing store in the west was taken away by them. I ran fast and took a small path to escape. Damn it, lives are at stake. Shoshing said as he lifted up his clothes.
从肚兜里掏出一个手巾包来，递给了林先生，又说道：“都在这里了。立市的那家黄茂记很可恶，这种户头我们明年要留心。我去洗一个脸，换件衣服再来。”林先生接了那手巾包，捏一把。
He took out a handkerchief bag from his belly pocket and handed it to Mr. Lin, and then said, "They're all here. The Huang Maoji store in Lisher is abominable. We should pay attention to this kind of account next year. I'm going to wash my face and change clothes and come back." Mr. Lin took the hand towel bag and squeezed it.
脸上有些笑容了。他到账台里打开那手巾包来，先看一看那张清单，打了一会儿算盘，然后点检银钱数目，是大洋11元，小洋200角，钞票420元，外加集期中票2张。
There was a smile on his face. He went to the counter and opened the bag of handkerchiefs. First, I took a look at the list, did some calculations, and then checked the amount of money. It was 11 yuan, 200 yuan, 420 yuan in banknotes, plus 2 bankers' bills at sight.
一张是归元50两，又一张是归元65两，这全部付给上海客人，照账算也还差100多元。林先生凝神想了半晌，斜眼偷看了坐在那里吸烟的上海客人几次，方才叹一口气。
One is for 50 taels of Gui yuan, and the other is for 65 taels of Gui yuan. All this was paid to the Shanghai guests, and according to the calculation, there was still a shortfall of more than 100 yuan. Mr. Lin thought for a long time, glanced sideways at the Shanghainese guests sitting there smoking several times, and then sighed.
割肉似的拿起那2张庄票和400元钞票捧到上海客人跟前，又说了许多话，方才得到上海客人点一下头，说一声对了。但是上海客人把庄票看了2遍，忽又笑着说道：“对不起，林老板。”
He picked up the 2 banknotes and the 400 yuan banknote as if cutting meat and held them up to the Shanghai guest. After saying a lot more, the Shanghai guest nodded and said, "That's right." But the Shanghai guest looked at the banker's ticket twice and suddenly said with a smile, "I'm sorry, Boss Lin."
这庄票，费神兑了钞票给我爸。可以，可以。林先生连忙回答，慌忙在庄票后面盖了本店的书简图章，派一个伙计到恒源庄去取现，并且叮嘱了要钞票。又过了半晌，伙计却是空手回来。
This banknote, please go to the trouble of cashing it and give it to me. Okay, okay. Mr. Lin replied quickly, hurriedly stamped the store's signature on the back of the banknote, sent a clerk to Henyuan village to withdraw cash, and asked for banknotes. After another long while, the clerk came back empty-handed.
恒源庄把票子收了，但不肯付钱，据说是扣抵了林先生的欠款。天是在当真下雪了，林先生也没张伞，冒雪到恒源庄去亲自交涉，结果是突然。林老板，怎样了呢？
Hengi Wanzwang took the note but refused to pay. It was said that it deducted the amount owed by Mr. Lin. It was really snowing, and Mr. Lin didn't even open an umbrella. He braved the snow to go to Henyuan village to negotiate in person, but the result was in vain. Boss Lin, what's going on?
看见林先生苦着脸跑回来，那上海客人不耐烦地问了。林先生几乎想哭出来，没有话回答，只是叹气。除了央求那上海客人再通融，还有什么别的办法？寿生也来了，帮着林先生说。
Seeing Mr. Lin running back with a grimace, the Shanghai guest asked impatiently. Mr. Lin almost wanted to cry. He had no words to answer and just sighed. Besides begging the Shanghai guest to be more accommodating, is there any other way? Shosheng also came and helped Mr. Lin.
他们赌咒下欠的200多元，赶明年初10边一定会到上海。是老主顾了，向来3节清账，从没半句话，这实在是意外之变。大局如此，没有办法，非是他们刁赖。然而不添一些。
They vowed that the more than 200 yuan they owed would be remitted to Shanghai on the 10th day of the Lunar New Year next year. He is an old customer. He has always settled his accounts in 3 quarters and never said a word. Today is really an unexpected change. The overall situation is like this. There is no way. It is not because of their unfaithfulness. But don't add any more.
到底是不行的。林先生忍能，又把这几天内卖得的现款凑成了50元，算是总共付了450元。这才把那位叫人头痛的上海收账客人送走了。此时已有11点了。
It won't work after all. Mr. Lin could not bear to collect the cash from the sales in the past few days and collected 50 yuan. He paid a total of 450 yuan before sending away the troublesome Shanghai bill collector. It was already 11 o'clock.
天还是飘飘扬扬落着雪，买客没有半个。林先生纳闷了一会儿，和寿生商量本街的账头怎样去收讨。两个人的眉头都皱紧了，都觉得本镇的600多元账头收起来真没有把握。
The sky is still fluttering with snow. There are no buyers. Mr. Lin was puzzled for a while, and discussed with Shousheng how to collect the accounts of this street. Both of them frowned, and both felt that the town was really unsure of how to close its account of more than 600 yuan.
寿生挨着林先生的耳朵悄悄地说道：“听说南栅的巨龙、西栅的河源都不稳呢，这两处欠我们的就有300光景，这两笔倒账要预先防着吃下了，可不是玩的。”林先生脸色变了。
Shousheng whispered into Mr. Lin's ear. I heard that Jilong in Nansha and Heiyuan in Shizha are not stable. These two places owe us 300 years. Shousheng whispered into Mr. Lin's ear. I heard that Jilong in Nansha and Heiyuan in Shizha are not stable. These two places owe us 300 years. We must be on guard against these two debts in advance. If we eat them, it is not a joke. Mr. Lin's expression changed.
嘴唇有点抖，不料寿生把声音再放低些，支支吾吾地说出了更骇人的消息来。还有讨厌的谣言是说我们这里了。恒源庄上一定听得了这些风声，这才对我们逼得那么急。
Lips tremble a little. Unexpectedly, Shousheng lowered his voice even lower and stammered even more shocking news. Also, there are nasty rumors about our place. The master of Hengyuan village must have heard these rumors, and that's why he was so anxious about us.
说不定上海的收账客人也有点晓得，只是谁和我们作对呢？难道就是斜对门吗？寿生说着，就把嘴向玉昌祥那边挠了一挠。林先生的眼光跟着寿生的嘴也向那边瞥了一下。
Maybe the bill collectors in Shanghai also know a little bit about it, but who is against us? Is it just diagonally opposite the door? As Shousheng spoke, he sipped toward Yu Changxiang. Mr. Lin's eyes followed Shousheng's mouth and glanced that way.
心里直是乱跳，哭丧着脸，好半天说不出话来。他的又麻又痛的心里感到这一次他准是毁了，不毁才是作怪。当老爷敲诈他，钱庄压逼他，同业又重伤他，而又要吃倒账。
My heart was beating wildly, I was crying, and I was speechless for a long time. His numb and painful heart felt that this time he must be ruined. He is the one who makes trouble if he does not destroy him. The party boss blackmails him, the bank oppresses him, his colleagues slander him, and he will suffer the consequences.
凭谁也受不了这样重重的磨折吧。而究竟为了什么，他应该活受罪啊？他从父亲手里继承下这小小的铺子，从没敢浪费。他做生意多么巴结，他没有害过人，没有起过歹心，就是他的祖上。
No one can bear such heavy torture. And for what reason should he suffer? He inherited this small shop from his father and never dared to waste it. He was so fawning in business. He had never harmed anyone or had any evil intentions. He was his ancestor.
也没害过人，做过歹事啊。然而他值如此命苦。不过师傅，随他们去造谣吧，你不要发急。荒年传乱话，听说是镇上的店铺10家有9家没法过年关，时势不好，市面轻的不成话。
I haven't harmed anyone or done anything bad. However, his life has been so miserable. But, master, just let them spread rumors and don't panic. Rumors are spreading in the famine years. I heard that 9 out of 10 shops in the town cannot celebrate the new year. The current situation is not good and the market is extremely clean.
素来硬朗的铺子今年都打饥荒，也不是我们一家困难。天他压大家，商会里总得一个办法出来，总不能大家一起拖倒，弄得市面更加不像市面。看见林先生疾苦了，寿生估计安慰着。
The store that has always been tough is facing a famine this year, so it's not a problem for our family. If the sky falls on everyone, the Chamber of Commerce must find a way to come up with it. We cannot bring it down all at once, making the market even less like a market. Seeing that Mr. Lin was in distress, Shousheng comforted him temporarily.
忍不住也叹了一口气，雪是愈下愈密了，街上已经渐白，偶尔有一条狗垂着尾巴走过，抖一抖身体，摇落了后积在毛上的那些雪，就又悄悄地夹着尾巴走了。自从有这条街以来
Couldn't help but sigh. The snow is getting thicker and thicker, and the streets are already turning white. Occasionally, a dog walks by with its tail hanging down. It shakes its body and shakes off the snow thickly accumulated on its fur, and then quietly walks away with its tail between its legs. Ever since this street existed,
从没见过这样冷落凄凉的年关。而此时，远在上海，日本军的重炮正在发狂地轰毁那边繁盛的市场。 凄凉的年关终于也过去了，镇上的大小铺子倒闭了28家，内中有一家。
I have never seen such a desolate New Year's Eve. At this time, far away in Shanghai, Japanese heavy artillery was frantically destroying the bustling shops there. 5. The desolate New Year has finally passed. 28 shops, large and small, closed down in the town. There is a
信用宿住的绸庄，欠了林先生300元货账的聚龙与和源也毕竟倒了。大年夜的白天，寿生到那2个铺子里磨了半天，也只拿了20多块来。这以后就听说没有一个收账员拿到半文钱。
Jilong and Heiyuan, a silk shop with a high reputation, finally collapsed. During the day of New Year's Eve, Shoshing went to the 2 shops for a long time and only took $2. More than 10 yuan. After that, I heard that no bill collector got half a penny.
2家铺子的老板都躲得不见面了。林先生自己呢，多亏商会长一力斡旋，还无需往乡下躲。然而欠下恒源钱庄的400多元，非要正月15以前还清不可，并且又定了苛刻的条件。
The owners of both shops avoided meeting each other. As for Mr. Lin himself, thanks to the mediation of the Chamber of Commerce chairman, he does not need to hide in the countryside. However, the more than 400 yuan he owes to Hengyuan Bank must be paid off before the 15th day of the first lunar month, and he has also set harsh conditions.
从正月初5开始那天起，恒源就要派人到林先生铺子里手提，卖得的钱8成归恒源扣账。新年那4天，林先生家里就像一个冰窖。林先生常常叹气，林大娘的打饿像连珠炮。
From the day the market opens on the 5th day of the first lunar month, Hengyuan will send people to Mr. Lin's shop to keep the money, and 80% of the money sold will be deducted from Hengyuan. During the 4 days of the new year, Mr. Lin's house was like an ice cellar. Mr. Lin sighed often, and Mrs. Lin's hiccups were like a volley of burps.
林小姐虽然不打饿，也不叹气，但是呆呆的，好像害了多年的黄病。她那件大绸新旗袍，为的要付吴妈的工钱，已经上了当铺。小学徒从清早7点钟就去那家唯一的当铺门前守候。
Although Miss Lin didn't hiccup or sigh, she looked as if she had been suffering from a yellow disease for many years. Although Miss Lin didn't hiccup or sigh, she looked as if she had been suffering from a yellow disease for many years. Her new silk cheongsam had been pawnshop to pay Mother Wu's wages. The little apprentice had been waiting in front of the only pawn shop since 7 o'clock in the morning.
直到9点钟，方才从人堆里拿了2块钱挤出来。以后当铺就只当了2块钱，这已是最高价。随你值多少钱的贵重衣饰，也只能当的2块呢，叫做2块钱封门。
It wasn't until 9 o'clock that I took 2 yuan from the crowd and squeezed it out. From now on, pawn shops will stop being pawn shops. $2. This is already the highest price. No matter how much valuable clothing you have, you can only get 2 pieces. It's called $2 to seal the door.
乡下人忍着冷包下身上的棉袄，递上柜台去。那当铺里的伙计拿起来抖了一抖，就直丢出去，怒声喊道：“不当！”元旦起是大好的晴天，关帝庙前那空场上。
The countryman endured the cold and peeled off his cotton-padded jacket and handed it to the counter. The pawnshop boy picked it up, shook it, threw it out, and shouted angrily, "Inappropriate." Starting from New Year's Day, it will be a nice sunny day. The empty field in front of Guandi Temple.
照例来了跑江湖赶新年生意的摊贩和变把戏的杂耍。人们在那些摊子面前懒懒地拖着腿走，2手门着空的腰包，就又懒懒地走开了。孩子们拉住了娘的衣角，赖在花炮摊前不肯走。
As usual, the vendors and jugglers who came to catch up on the New Year business came. People dragged their legs lazily in front of those stalls, holding their empty pockets with both hands, and walked away lazily. The children grabbed the mother's clothes and stayed in front of the fireworks stall, refusing to leave.
娘就给他一个老大的耳光。那些特来赶新年的摊贩们连伙食都开销不了，白赖在安商客寓里，天天和客寓主人吵闹。只有那般变把戏的出了8块钱的大生意。
Mom gave him a slap in the face. Those street vendors who came especially to celebrate the new year couldn't even afford food, so they stayed in the Anshan guest house and quarreled with the owner of the guest house every day. Only the jugglers made a big business of $8.
当老爷们唤他们去点缀了一番生平气象。初4那天晚上，林先生勉强筹措了3块钱，办一喜酒，请铺子里的相好吃照例的5路酒，商量明天开市的办法。林先生早就筹思过熟透。
The party bosses called them to embellish the atmosphere of prosperity. On the night of the 4th day of the Lunar New Year, Mr. Lin barely raised 3 yuan to hold a banquet and treat the good friends in the shop to the usual 5-road wine and discuss ways to open the market tomorrow. Mr. Lin has already thought about it thoroughly.
这铺子开下去呢， 眼见的是亏本的生意，不开呢，他一家三口简直没有生计，而且到底人家欠他的货账还有400-500，他一关门更难逃去，唯一的办法是减省开支。
As long as this shop is open, it will be a loss-making business. If it doesn't open, his family of 3 will have no livelihood. Moreover, they still owe him 400 to 500 yuan for goods. It will be even harder for him to collect it once it closes. The only way is reduce expenses.
但捐税派想是逃不了的，敲诈尤其无法躲避，才去1-2个店员罢。本来他只有3个伙计，寿生是左右手，其余的2位也是怪可怜见的，况且辞谢了，到底也不够招呼生意。家里呢？
But taxes and salaries cannot be avoided, and blackmail especially cannot be avoided. Let's just lay off 1 or 2 clerks. Originally, he only had 3 clerks, Shousheng was his right-hand man, and the other 2 were very pitiful. Besides, it would be hard to quit even after they quit. Not enough to attract business. What about home?
也无可再省，吴妈早已辞谢。她觉得只有硬着头皮做下去，或者靠菩萨的保佑，乡下人春蚕熟，她的亏空还可以补救。但要开始，最大的困难是缺乏货品，没有现钱寄到上海去。
There is nothing to worry about anymore. Wu Ma has already resigned. He felt that he could make up for his shortcomings if he just had to keep going, or rely on the blessing of bodhisattvas to make the country people spring silkworms mature. But the biggest difficulty in opening the market is the lack of goods. There is no cash to send to Shanghai.
就拿不到货，上海打得更厉害了，赊账是休转这念头。卖底货罢，他店里早已淘空，架子上那些装卫生衣的纸盒就是空的，不过摆在那里装幌子。他铺子里就剩了些日用杂货。
Can't get the goods. The fight in Shanghai is getting worse, so there is no need to think about credit. After selling off the bottom products, his store has long been sold out, and the cartons containing sanitary robes on the shelves are empty, but they are just there as a pretense. There were only some daily groceries left in his shop.
脸盆、毛巾之类存底还厚，大家喝了一会闷酒，抓塞挖耳的想不出好主意。后来谈起闲天来，一个伙计忽然说：“乱世年头，人比不上狗。听说上海闸北烧得精光。”
Wash basin towels and the like are quite thick. Everyone drank for a while and scratched their cheeks and ears, unable to come up with any good ideas. Later, when we were talking about Xiantian, a waiter suddenly said, "In these troubled times, people are no match for dogs." I heard that Zhebei, Shanghai, was burned to the ground.
几十万人都只逃得一个光身子。虹口一带呢，烧是还没烧，人都逃光了。东洋人凶得很，不许搬东西。上海房钱涨起几倍，逃出来的人都到乡下来了。昨天镇上就到了一批。
Hundreds of thousands of people escaped naked. In the Hongkou area, even though the fire had not yet started, everyone had fled. Hundreds of thousands of people escaped naked. In the Hongkou area, even though the fire had not yet started, everyone had fled. The Japanese were very fierce and were not allowed to move anything. Housing prices in Shanghai have increased several times. The people who escaped have all come to the countryside, and a group of them arrived in the town yesterday.
看样子都是好好的人家，现在却弄得无家可归。林先生摇头叹气。寿生听了这话，猛地想起了一个好办法。他放下了筷子，拿起酒杯来一口喝干了，笑嘻嘻对林先生说道：“师傅。”
They seem to be from good families, but now they are homeless. Mr. Lin shook his head and sighed. After hearing this, Shousheng suddenly thought of a good idea. He put down his chopsticks, picked up the wine glass and drank it all in one gulp. He smiled and said to Mr. Lin, "Master."
听得阿四的话吗？我们那些脸盆、毛巾、肥皂、袜子、牙粉、牙刷就可以如数销清了。林先生瞪出了眼睛，不懂得寿生的意思。师傅，这是天大的机会。上海逃来的人总还有几个钱。
Do you hear what Asi said? Our wash basins, towels, soap, socks, tooth powder, and toothbrushes can all be sold off. Mr. Lin stared, not understanding what Shousheng meant. Master, this is a great opportunity. People who escape from Shanghai. Do you hear what Asi said? Our wash basins, towels, soap, socks, tooth powder, and toothbrushes can all be sold off. Mr. Lin stared, not understanding what Shousheng meant. Master, this is a great opportunity.
他们总要买些日用的东西，是不是？这笔生意，我们赶快张罗。寿生接着又说：“再筛出一杯酒来喝了，满脸是喜气。”2个伙计也醒悟过来了，哈哈大笑。只有林先生还不很了然。
They always have to buy some daily necessities, right? Let's get this business done as soon as possible. Shousheng continued. He sifted out another glass of wine and drank it, his face full of joy. The 2 guys also realized it and laughed. Only Mr. Lin didn't understand it very well.
近来的逆境已经把他变成糊涂。他惘然问道：“你拿得稳吗？脸盆、毛巾，别家也有。师傅，你忘记了，脸盆、毛巾一类的东西，只有我们存底独多。玉昌祥里拿不出10只脸盆，而且都是捡剩货。”
Recent adversity has turned him into confusion. He asked in confusion, "Are you able to hold it steady? There are wash basins and towels at other places, too." Master, you forgot. We are the only ones who have a lot of things like wash basins and towels. Yuchang Xiangli can't afford 10 wash basins, and they only pick up leftovers.
这笔生意逃不出我们的手掌心的了。我们赶快多写几张广告到四栅去分贴逃难人住的地方。哎，阿四，他们住在什么地方？我们也要去贴广告。他们有亲戚的住到亲戚家里去了，没有的。
This business cannot escape our hands. We quickly wrote a few more advertisements and distributed them in Sitsa, where the refugees lived. Hey, see, where did they live? We also need to put up advertisements. Some of them have relatives and live with their relatives, and some of them don't.
还借住在西栅外碱厂的空房子。叫做阿四的伙计回答，脸上发亮，很得意自己的无意中立了大功。林先生这时也完全明白了，心里一快乐，就又灵活起来。他马上拟好了广告的底稿。
He also borrowed an empty house in the cocoon factory outside Shizha. The guy named Asi replied, his face lit up. He was very proud that he had unintentionally made a great contribution. Mr. Lin also completely understood it at this time. As soon as he felt happy, he became flexible again, and he immediately drafted the advertisement. Manuscript.
专检店里有的日用品开列上去，约莫也有10几种。他又模仿上海大商店卖1元货的方法，把脸盆、毛巾、牙刷、牙粉配成一套卖1块钱，广告上就大书大廉价1元货。
I specially selected the daily necessities available in the store and listed them. There are about a dozen types. He also imitated the method of selling 1 yuan goods in big stores in Shanghai. He put a wash basin, towel, toothbrush, and tooth powder into a set and sold them for 1 yuan. The advertisement read, "Big cheap 1 yuan goods."
店里本来还有余剩下的红绿纸，瘦身大张的裁好了，拿笔就写。2个伙计和学徒就乱哄哄的拿过脸盆、毛巾、牙刷、牙粉来装配成一组。人手不够，林先生叫女儿出来帮着写，帮着搭配。
There was some red and green paper left in the store, so Shoshin cut it into a big sheet and started writing with a pen. The 2 waiters and the apprentice hurriedly took the wash basin, towel, toothbrush, and tooth powder to assemble it into a set. There was not enough manpower, so Mr. Lin asked his daughter to come out and help with writing and tying.
另外又配出几种1元货，全是零星的日用必需品。这一晚上，林家铺子里直忙到5更左右，方才大致就绪。第二天清早，开门鞭炮响过，排门开了，林家铺子布置的又是一新。
In addition, there are several kinds of 1 yuan goods, all of which are scattered daily necessities. That night, the Lin family shop was busy until about 5 o'clock, and it was almost ready. Early the next morning, firecrackers went off when the door opened, the row of doors opened, and the Lin's shop was decorated again.
漏夜赶起来的广告早已漏夜分头贴出去。西栅外碱厂一带是寿生亲自去布置，轰动那些借住在碱厂里的逃难人都起来看，当作一件新闻。内宅里，林大娘也起了个5更。
The advertisements that were late at night have already been posted separately. Shoshin personally arranged the cocoon factory area outside Shizha, coaxing the refugees living in the cocoon factory to get up and watch it, treating it as a piece of news. In the inner house, Aunt Lin also woke up at midnight.
慈观音面前点了香，林大娘爬着磕了半天响头。她什么都祷告全了，就只差没有祷告菩萨要上海的战事再扩大在盐场，好多来些逃难人。一切都很顺利，一切都不出寿生的预料。
Incense was lit in front of porcelain guanyin, and Mrs. Lin crawled and kowtowed for a long time. She prayed for everything except praying to the Bodhisattva that the war in Shanghai would expand and be prolonged and that more people would flee. Everything went smoothly, and everything went beyond Shoshin's expectations.
新征开市第一天就指林家铺子生意很好，到下午4点多钟，居然卖了100多元，是这镇上近10年来未有的新纪录。销售的大宗果然是1元货，然而阳伞、橡皮、雨鞋之类却也带起了销路。
On the first day that the new market opened, only Lin's shop was doing very well. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, it sold for more than 100 yuan, which was a new record that had not been seen in this town in the past 10 years. The bulk of the sales were indeed 1 yuan goods, but umbrellas, rubber rain boots and the like also generated sales.
并且那生意也做得干脆有味。虽然是逃难人，却毕竟住在上海，见过大场面。他们不像乡下人或本镇人那么小格式，他们买东西很爽利，拿起货来看了一眼，现钱交易从不捡来捡去。
And the business was done very well. Although they are refugees, they live in Shanghai after all and have seen big events. They are not as petty as country people or local people. They buy things easily. They pick up the goods and take a look. They never trade with cash. Picking and picking.
也不硬要出零头。林大娘看见女儿兴冲冲地跑进来夸说一回，就爬到慈观音面前磕了一回头。她心里还转了这样的念头，要不是岁数相差得多，把寿生招做女婿倒也是好的。
Don't insist on cutting off the odds. When Mrs. Lin saw her daughter running in happily and boasting, she climbed up to the porcelain guanyin and kowtowed. She also had this thought in her mind: if the age difference wasn't so different, it would be a good idea to recruit Shousheng as her son-in-law.
说不定在寿生那边也时常用半只眼睛看望着这位私塾的17岁的师妹。只有一点使林先生扫兴，恒源庄毫不顾面子地派人来提取了当天营业总数的80%，并且存户朱三阿泰。
Maybe Shousheng would often look at this familiar 17-year-old junior sister with half an eye. There was only one thing that disappointed Mr. Lin. Hengyuan village sent someone to withdraw 80% of the day's total business without any regard for face. And the depositor is Zhu Sanatai.
桥头陈老七还有张寡妇，不知听了谁的怂恿，都借了要2米吃的借口，都来预支息金。不但支息金，还想拔提一点存款呢。但也有一个喜讯，听说又到了一批逃难人。晚餐时
Quoto Chen Laochi and Widow Zhang, I don't know who listened to the instigation. They all use the excuse of measuring rice to eat to advance interest, not only to pay interest, but also to withdraw some savings. Quoto Chen Laochi and Widow Zhang, I don't know who listened to the instigation. They all use the excuse of measuring rice to eat to advance interest, not only to pay interest, but also to withdraw some savings. But there is also good news. I heard that another group of refugees have arrived. At dinner.
林先生添了2碟荤菜酬劳他的店员，大家称赞寿生能干。林先生虽然高兴，却不能不惦念着朱三阿泰等3位存户是要提存款的事情。大新年碰到这种事总是不吉利。寿生愤然说
Mr. Lin added 2 plates of meat dishes to reward his waiter. Everyone praised Shousheng for his ability. Although Mr. Lin was happy, he couldn't help but worry about the fact that the 3 depositors, including Zhu San and Mrs. Zhu, wanted to withdraw their deposits. It is always unlucky to encounter this kind of thing during the new year. Shousheng said angrily.
那3个懂得什么呢？还不是有人从中挑拨。说着，寿生的嘴又向斜对门挠了一挠。林先生点头。可是这3位不懂什么的，倒也难以对付。一个是老头子，2个是孤苦的女人，软说不肯。
What do those 3 know? It's not like someone is provoking it. As he spoke, Shousheng sipped diagonally towards the door again. Mr. Lin nodded. But these 3 people didn't know anything, so it was difficult to deal with them. One was an old man, and the 2 were lonely women. To put it mildly, refuse.
硬来又不成。林先生想了半天，觉得只有去找商会长，请他去和那3位宝贝讲开。他和寿生说了，寿生也竭力赞成。于是晚饭后算过了当天的流水账，林先生就去拜访商会长。
It's impossible to force yourself to do it. After thinking for a long time, Mr. Lin decided that the only option was to go to the president of the Chamber of Commerce and ask him to talk to the 3 treasures. He told Shousheng about it, and Shousheng also strongly agreed. So after dinner, after calculating the day's running accounts, Mr. Lin went to visit the president of the Chamber of Commerce.
林先生说明了来意后，那商会长一口就应承了，还夸奖林先生做生意的手段高明，他那铺子一定能够站住，而且上进。摸着自己的下巴，商会长又笑了一笑，余过身体来说道：“有一件事。”
After Mr. Lin explained his intention, the president of the Chamber of Commerce agreed immediately and praised Mr. Lin for his excellent business skills. His shop would definitely be able to stand up and make progress. Touching his chin, the Chamber of Commerce president smiled again, leaned over and said, There's one thing.
早就想对你说，只是没有机会。镇上的卜局长不知在哪里见过林爱来，极为中意。卜局长年将40，还没有儿子，屋子里虽则放着2个人，都没生育过。要是另爱过去，生下1男半女。
I've wanted to tell you for a long time, but I just didn't have the chance. Director Bu in the town had seen your lady come somewhere, and he was very fond of her. Director Bu was almost 40 years old and had no son yet. Although there were 2 people in the house, neither of them had given birth. If Ling Ai came and gave birth to a boy and a half, female.
就是县城的局长太太。呵，那时就连我也沾点光呢。林先生做梦也想不到会有这样的难题，当下怔住了做不得声。商会长却又郑重地接着说：“我们是老朋友，什么话都可以讲个明白。”
She is the ready-made wife of the director. Oh, at that time, even I had some light. Mr. Lin never dreamed that there would be such a problem, and he was stunned and speechless. But the president of the Chamber of Commerce continued solemnly. We are old friends, and we can explain everything clearly.
论到这种事呢，赵老派说好像面子上不好听，然而也不尽然。现在通行这一套，另爱过去也算是正的。况且卜局长既然有了这个心，不答应他有许多不便之处，答应了将来倒有巴望。
When it comes to this kind of thing, according to the old school, it seems that it doesn't look good on face, but that's not necessarily the case. This is the current practice, and your wife was considered right in the past. Besides, since Director Bu has this intention, there will be a lot of inconvenience if he doesn't agree. If he agrees, he will have hope in the future.
我是替你打算才说这个话，可你怕不是好意劝我仔细。可是我是小户人家，小女又不懂规矩，高攀卜局长实在不敢。林先生硬着头皮说，心里补乱跳。哈哈，不是你高攀，是他中意。
I said this because I had plans for you. Ahem, I'm afraid you don't mean well to advise me to be careful. However, I come from a small family and my daughter doesn't understand the rules. I really don't dare to go up to Director Bu. Mr. Lin said bravely, his heart pounding wildly. Ha, ha, it's not you who wants it, it's him who likes it.
就这么吧，你回去和尊夫人商量商量，我这里且搁着，看见卜局长时就说还没机会提过，行不行呢？可是你得早点给我回音。愁思了半晌，林先生勉强应着，脸色像是死人。回到家里
That's it. You go back and discuss it with Madam. I'll leave it here. When you see Director Bu, just say that you haven't had a chance to mention it yet, okay? That's it. You go back and discuss it with Madam. I'll leave it here. When you see Director Bu, just say that you haven't had a chance to mention it yet, okay? But you have to give me a reply soon. Well. After thinking for a long time, Mr. Lin reluctantly responded, with a dead look on his face. Back home.
林先生支开了女儿，就一五一十对林大娘说了。他还没说完，林大娘的恶就大发作，光景邻居都听得清。他勉强抑住了那些涌上来的恶，喘着气说道：“怎么能够答应？就不是小老婆。
Mr. Lin put his daughter away and told Mrs. Lin everything. Before he could finish speaking, Mrs. Lin started to scream loudly, and even the neighbors could hear her clearly. She barely suppressed the ughs that came over her, and gasped, How can I agree? I'm not a little wife,
我也舍不得阿秀到人家去做媳妇，我也是这个意思。不过，我们规规矩矩做生意，难道我们不肯，他好抢了去不成？不过他一定要来找额头生事，这种人比强盗还狠心。
I can't bear to see Axiu become someone else's wife. That's what I mean too, but, we do business in a disciplined manner. Don't we agree that he can rob us? But he must come to cause trouble. This kind of person is more cruel than a robber.
林先生低声说，几乎落下眼泪来。我拼了这条老命，救苦救难观世音呀！林大娘颤着声音站了起来，摇摇摆摆想走。林先生赶快拦住，没口地叫道：“往哪里去？往哪里去？”
Mr. Lin whispered, almost crying. I risked my life. Ugh. Save the suffering, Guanyin. Mrs. Lin stood up with a trembling voice, swaying and wanting to leave. Mr. Lin quickly stopped him and shouted silently. Where to go? Where to go?
同时，林小姐也从房外来了，显然已经听见了一些，脸色灰白，眼睛死瞪瞪的。林大娘看见女儿，就一把抱住了，一边哭一边打一边喃喃地挣扎着，喘着气说：“阿南，谁来抢你去？”
At the same time, Miss Lin also came from outside the room. She had obviously heard something. Her face was gray and her eyes were staring. When Mrs. Lin saw her daughter, she hugged her. While crying and hiccuping, she murmured, struggling and gasping for air, Grandma, who's going to rob you,
我同他拼老命，生你那年我得了这个病，好容易养到17岁，死也死在一块儿，早给了寿生多么好呢，强盗，不怕天打的。林小姐也哭了，叫着妈。林先生搓着手叹气。
I will fight for my life with him. I got this disease when I was born. I managed to survive until I was 17. I died at the same time. Well, it's great to have given it to Shousheng earlier. Well, robber. Don't be afraid of God's beating. Miss Lin also cried, shouting, Mom. Mr. Lin rubbed his hands and sighed.
看看哭得不像样，窄房浅屋的要惊动邻舍，大新年也不吉利，他只好忍着一肚子气来劝母女两个。这一夜，林家3口都没有好生睡觉。明天一早，林先生还得起来做生意。
Seeing that the crying was not appropriate, the narrow house and the shallow house would alarm the neighbors, and the new year was also unlucky, so he had to endure his anger to persuade the mother and daughter. That night, none of the 3 members of the Lin family slept well. Mr. Lin will still have to do business early tomorrow morning.
在一夜的转侧愁思中，他偶尔听得屋面上一声响，心就补补地跳，以为是卜局长来寻他生事来了。然而定了神，仔细想起来，自家是规规矩矩的生意人，又没犯法，只要生意好。
In the night of wandering and thinking, he occasionally heard a sound on the roof, and his heart started to beat wildly, thinking that Director Boo was coming to cause trouble for him. However, when he calmed down and thought about it carefully, he realized that his house was well behaved. Businessmen are not breaking the law, as long as the business is good.
不欠人家的钱，难道好无端生事，白诈他不成？而他的生意呢，眼前分明有一线生机。生了个女儿，长得还端正，却又要招祸。早些定了亲，也许不会出这岔子。商会长是不是肯真心帮忙呢？
If you don't owe someone money, why do you want to cause trouble for no reason and deceive him for nothing? As for his business, there is clearly a glimmer of hope ahead. After giving birth to a daughter, she looks decent, but she is going to cause trouble. If we had arranged the engagement earlier, maybe this mistake wouldn't have happened? Is the president of the Chamber of Commerce really willing to help?
只有恳求他设法，可是林大娘又在打饿了。可他这病，天刚发白，林先生就起身，眼圈有点红肿，头里发昏。可是他不能不打起精神招呼生意，铺面上靠瘦生一个到底不行。
He could only plead with him to try something, but Mrs. Lin was hiccuping again. Cough, she is sick. As soon as the sky turned white, Mr. Lin stood up. His eye circles were a little red and swollen, and his head felt dizzy. But he had to cheer up and greet business. It's really not possible to live a life of longevity in a shop.
这小伙子近几天来也就累得够了。林先生坐在账台里，心总不定。生意虽然好，他却时时浑身的肉发抖。看见面生的大汉子上来买东西，他就疑惑是卜局长派来的人来侦查他，来巡视。
This young man has been tired enough in recent days. Mr. Lin sat at the counter, feeling uncertain. Although business was good, his whole body was shaking from time to time. When he saw the old man coming up to buy something, he suspected that he was someone sent by Director Boo to spy on him and stir up trouble.
他的心直跳得发痛，却也作怪，这天生意之好，出人意料。到正午，已经卖了50-60元，买客们中间也有本镇人，那简直不像买东西，简直像是抢东西。
His heart beat painfully. But he also acted strangely. Business was surprisingly good that day. By noon, it had been sold for 50 or 60 yuan, and some of the buyers were from this town. It didn't feel like buying something, it just felt like robbing something.
只有倒闭了铺子拍卖底货的时候才有这种光景。林先生一边有点高兴，一边却也看着心惊，他估量这样的好生意气色不正。果然在午饭的时候，寿生就悄悄告诉道，外边又有谣言。
This situation only occurs when a shop closes down and auctions off its stock. Mr. Lin was a little happy, but at the same time he was frightened. He thought that such a good business does not look good. Sure enough, during lunch, Shoshin quietly told. There are rumors again outside.
说是你拆烂屋卖一批贱货，捞到几个钱就打算逃走。林先生又气又怕，开不得口。突然来了2个穿制服的人，直闯进来问道：“谁是林老板？”林先生慌忙站了起来，还没回答。
It is said that you demolished the trash and sold a batch of cheap goods. After making a few money, you planned to run away. Mr. Lin was so angry and scared that he couldn't speak. Suddenly 2 men in uniforms came and barged in and asked, Who is Boss Lin? Mr. Lin stood up in a hurry and didn't answer yet.
2个穿制服的拉住他就走，寿生追上去，想要拦阻，又想要探寻，那2个人厉声吆喝道：“你是谁？滚开！党部里要他问话。”6. 那天下午，林先生就没有回来，店里生意忙。
2 men in uniform grabbed him and left. Shoshin chased after him, wanting to stop him, but also wanting to inquire. The 2 men shouted loudly, Dash. Who are you? Get out of here. The party headquarters wants to question him. 6. That afternoon, Mr. Lin did not come back. The store is busy.
寿生又不能抽空身子进自去探听。里边林大娘本来还被瞒着，不妨小学徒漏了嘴，林大娘那一集几乎一口气死去。他又死不放林小姐出那对蝴蝶门，说是
Shoshin couldn't spare the time to inquire by himself. Inside, Aunt Lin was still being kept secret, but unexpectedly the apprentice leaked the information, and Aunt Lin almost died in one breath due to her panic. She refused to let Miss Lin out of the pair of butterfly doors, saying,
你的爸爸已经被他们捉去了，回头就要来抢你。他只叫寿生进来问底细，寿生瞧着情形不便直说，只含糊安慰了几句道：“师母，不要着急，没有事的。师傅到党部里去理值那些存款呢。”
Your father has been captured by them, and they will come to snatch you back. She only asked Shousheng to come in and ask for details. Seeing the situation, Shousheng couldn't speak directly, so he only said a few words of vague comfort. Master, don't be anxious, it's okay. The master went to the party headquarters to sort out the deposits.
我们的生意好，怕什么的？被赚了林大娘的面，寿生悄悄告诉林小姐到底为什么，还没得个准信儿。他叮嘱林小姐且安心伴着师母，外边是有他呢。林小姐一点主意也没有。寿生说一句
Our business is good, so what are we afraid of? Turning his back to Mrs. Lin, Shousheng quietly told Miss Lin, Why, we haven't got any accurate information yet. He told Miss Lin to stay with Master's wife, with peace of mind. He was there for the outside world. Lin. The young lady has no idea at all, Shousheng said.
他就点一下头，这样又要照顾外面的生意，又要挖空心思找出话来对付林大娘不时的追寻，寿生更没有功夫去探听林先生的下落。直到上灯时分，这才由商会长给他一个信。
She just nodded. In this way, he has to attract outside business and find words to deal with Aunt Lin's constant inquiries. Shousheng has no time to find out Mr. Lin's whereabouts. It wasn't until it was time to turn on the lights that the president of the Chamber of Commerce gave him a letter.
林先生是被党部扣住了，为得外边谣言，林先生打算卷款逃走。然而林先生除有庄款和客账未清外，还有朱三阿太、桥头陈老七、张寡妇3位孤苦人的存款共计650元没有保障。
Mr. Lin was detained by the party because there were rumors that Mr. Lin planned to escape with the money. However, in addition to the bank account and unpaid customer accounts, Mr. Lin also had Mrs. Zhu San, Quoto Chen Laoqi, and widow Zhang San. The orphan's savings totaling 650 yuan are not guaranteed.
党部里是专替这些孤苦人谋利益的，所以把林先生扣起来，要他理值这些存款。寿生吓得脸都黄了，呆了半晌，方才问道：“先把人保出来，行吗？人不出来，哪里去弄钱来呢？”嘿，保出人来。
The party headquarters was specifically looking for benefits for these lonely people, so they detained Mr. Lin and asked him to straighten out these deposits. Shousheng was so frightened that his face turned yellow. He was stunned for a long time and then asked, Bail the people out first, okay? The party headquarters was specifically looking for benefits for these lonely people, so they detained Mr. Lin and asked him to straighten out these deposits. Shousheng was so frightened that his face turned yellow. He was stunned for a long time and then asked, Bail the people out first, okay? If the people don't come out, where will we get the money? Hey! Save someone.
你空手去，让你保吗？会长先生，总求你想想法子，做好事。师傅和你老人家向来交情也不差，总求你做好事。商会长皱着眉头沉吟了一会儿，又端详着寿生半晌。
If you go empty-handed, do you want to protect me? Mr. President, I always ask you to think of ways to do good things. Master and you have always been on good terms with each other. I always ask you to do good things. If you go empty-handed, do you want to protect me? Mr. President, I always ask you to think of ways to do good things. Master and you have always been on good terms with each other. I always ask you to do good things. The president of the Chamber of Commerce frowned and pondered for a while, and then looked at Shousheng for a while.
然后一把拉寿生到屋角里，悄悄说道：“你师傅的事，我岂有袖手旁观之理？只是这件事现在弄僵了。老实对你说，我求过卜局长出面讲情，卜局长只要你师傅答应一件事，他是肯帮忙的。”
Then Alasho came to the corner of the room and whispered, There's no reason for me to stand by and watch your master's affairs. It's just that this matter is now deadlocked. To be honest with you, I beg Director Bu to intercede. Director Bu only needs your master to agree to one thing, and he is willing to help. Then Alasho came to the corner of the room and whispered, There's no reason for me to stand by and watch your master's affairs. It's just that this matter is now deadlocked. To be honest with you, I beg Director Bu to intercede. Director Bu only needs your master to agree to one thing, and he is willing to help.
我刚才到党部里会见你的师傅，劝他答应，他也答应了，那不是事情完了吗？不料党部里那个黑麻子真可恶，他硬不肯。难道他不给卜局长面子？就是啊，黑麻子反而噜里噜嗦说了许多。
I just went to the party headquarters to meet with your master and persuaded him to agree, and he agreed. Isn't that the end of the matter? Unexpectedly, That black pockmarked man in the party headquarters is really hateful. He refuses to. Don't he give Director Bu face? That's right. Instead, Hey Motzi talked a lot.
卜局长几乎下不得台，两个人闹翻了。这不是这件事弄得僵透。寿生叹了口气，没有主意。停一会儿，他又叹一口气说：“可是师傅并没犯什么罪，他们不同你讲理，谁有事谁就有理。”
Director Bu could hardly step down. The two had a falling out. Isn't this what made it so stiff? Shoshing sighed and had no idea. After a pause, he sighed again and said, but the master has not committed any crime. They don't want to reason with you. Whoever has power is justified.
你去对林大娘说，放心，还没吃苦，不过要想出来，总得花点钱。商会长说着，伸两个指头一扬，就匆匆地走了。寿生沉吟着，没有主意。两个伙计攒住他探问，他也不回答。商会长这番话
Go and tell Mrs. Lin, don't worry, you haven't suffered yet, but you have to spend some money to figure it out. The president of the Chamber of Commerce said, raised 2 fingers, and hurried away. Shoshing pondered, without any idea. 2 guys stopped him to ask, but he didn't answer. The president of the Chamber of Commerce said these words.
可以告诉师母吗？又得花钱。师母有没有思绪，他不知道。至于店里，他很明白，2天来卖得的现钱被恒源提了8成去，剩下只有50多块，记得什么事？商会长示意总得200。
Can you tell teacher's wife? Have to spend money again. He didn't know if teacher's wife had any personal savings. As for the store, he knew very well that Heng Yuan had withdrawn 80% of the cash from the sales in the past 2 days, leaving only more than 50 yuan. So what kind of help was there? The president of the Chamber of Commerce indicated that the total would be 200.
知道还够不够呀？照这样下去，生意再好些也不中用。他觉得有点灰心了。里边又在叫他了，他只好进去瞧光景，再定主意。林大娘扶住了女儿的肩头，气喘喘地问道：“刚才
Is it enough to know? If this continues, it will be useless no matter how good the business is." He felt a little discouraged. They're calling him again. He had no choice but to go in and take a look at the scene before making up his mind. Aunt Lin held her daughter's shoulders and asked breathlessly, just now,
商会长来了，说什么？没有来呀。寿生撒一个谎，你不用瞒我，我全知道了，你的脸色吓得焦黄。阿秀看见的，师母放心，商会长说过不要紧，卜局长肯帮忙。什么？什么
The president of the Chamber of Commerce is here. What do you say? Not coming. Shoshing told a lie. You don't have to hide it from me. I know everything. Your face turned yellow with fear. Ah Xiu saw it. Don't worry, master, the president of the Chamber of Commerce said it doesn't matter. Director Bu is willing to help. What? A what?
卜局长肯帮忙。大慈大悲的菩萨，不要他帮忙。我知道你的师傅，没有命了。我也不要活了。只是这阿秀，我放心不下。你同了他去。你们好好的做人家。
Director Bu is willing to help. The great merciful and compassionate Bodhisattva, don't ask for his help. I know, your master, is dead. I don't want to live anymore either. It's just that Axiu, I can't worry about it. You went with her. Be a good person.
寿生，你待阿秀好，我就放心了。去啊，他们要来抢。狠心的强盗，观世音菩萨怎么不显灵呀？寿生睁大了眼睛，不知道怎样回话。他以为师母疯了，但可又一点不像疯。他偷眼看他的。
Shosheng, if you treat Axiu well, I will feel relieved. Go ahead. They're coming to snatch it. Ugh, cruel robber. Why doesn't Avalokitesvara Bodhisattva appear? Shosheng opened his eyes wide and didn't know how to reply. He thought master's wife was crazy, but she was not crazy at all. He peeked at his.
师妹心里有点跳。林小姐满脸通红，低了头不作声。寿生哥，寿生哥，有人找你说话。小学徒一路跳着喊进来。寿生慌忙跑出去，总以为又是商会长什么的来了。
Junior sister, her heart was beating a little. Miss Lin's face turned red, she lowered her head and remained silent. Brother Shosheng, someone is looking to talk to you. The young apprentice came in jumping all the way. Shousheng ran out in a hurry, always thinking that the president of the Chamber of Commerce or something was coming again.
哪里知道竟是鞋对门玉昌祥的掌柜吴先生。他来干什么？寿生肚子里想，眼光盯住在吴先生的脸上。吴先生问过了林先生的消息，就满脸笑容，连说不要紧。寿生觉得那笑脸有点异样。
Who knew it was Mr. Wu, the shopkeeper of Yuchangxiang across the street? What is he here for? Shousheng thought, his eyes fixed on Mr. Wu's face. After Mr. Wu asked about Mr. Lin's news, he smiled and said, "It doesn't matter." Shousheng felt that the smiling face was a bit strange.
我是来找你划一点货。吴先生收了笑容，忽然转了口气，从袖子里摸出一张纸来，是一张横单，写着10几行，正是林先生所卖1元货的全部。寿生一眼瞧见就明白了，原来是这个把戏啊。
I came to you to make some deals. Mr. Wu stopped smiling, suddenly changed his tone, and took out a piece of paper from his sleeve. It was a horizontal slip with more than 10 lines written on it. It was Lin. All the 1 yuan goods that Mr. Shousheng was selling were immediately understood by him. It turned out to be this trick.
他立刻说：“师傅不在，我不能做主。你和你师母说，还不是一样？”寿生踌躇着不能回答。他现在有点懂得林先生之所以被捕了。先是谣言林先生要想逃，其次是林先生被扣住了。
He immediately said, "Master is not here, I can't make the decision. You told your wife, it's not the same." Shousheng hesitated and could not answer. He now somewhat understood why Mr. Lin was arrested. First, it was rumored that Mr. Lin wanted to escape, and secondly, Mr. Lin was detained.
而现在却是玉昌祥来挖货，这一连串的线索都明白了。寿生想来有点气，又有点怕。他很知道，要是答应了吴先生的要求，那么林先生的生意，自己的一番心血都完了。可是不答应啊。
But now it was Yuchangxiang who came to dig up the goods, and the series of clues were all clear. Shousheng was a little angry and a little scared when he thought about it. He knew very well that if he agreed to Mr. Wu's request, then Mr. Lin's business and all his hard work would be over. But he didn't agree.
还有什么把戏来？他简直不敢想下去了。最后，他姑且试一试说：“那么，我去和师母说。可是师母女人家准要做现钱交易，现钱吗？哈，寿生，你是说笑话吧？师母是这种脾气，我也是没法。”
He simply didn't dare think about what other tricks he could do. Finally, he gave it a try and said, "Then, I'll go tell my wife, but my wife specializes in cash transactions." Cash money? Huh, Shousheng, are you joking? Master's wife has this kind of temper, and I can't help it.
最好等明天再谈吧。刚才商会常说，卜局长肯帮忙讲情，光景师傅今晚上就可以回来了。寿生故意冷冷地说，就把那张横单塞还吴先生的手里。吴先生脸上的肉一跳。
It's best to wait until tomorrow to talk about it. The president of the Chamber of Commerce said just now that Director Bu is willing to help negotiate, and Master Guangjing can come back tonight. Shousheng said deliberately coldly, and put the horizontal slip back into Mr. Wu's hand. The flesh on Mr. Wu's face jumped.
慌忙把横单又推回到寿生手里，一面没口应承道：“好，好，现账就是现账，今晚上交货就是现账。”寿生皱着眉头再到里边，把玉昌祥来挖货的事情对林大娘说了，并且劝他：“师母。”
He hurriedly pushed the hangdan back into Shousheng's hand and said silently, "Okay, okay, the current account is the current account. The delivery tonight is the current account." Shousheng frowned and went back inside. He told Mrs. Lin about Yuchangxiang's coming to hunt for goods, and advised her, "Teacher's wife."
刚才商会长来，确实说师傅好好的在那里，并没吃苦，不过总得花几个钱才能出来。店里只有50块，现在玉昌祥来挖货，照这单子上看，总也有150块光景，还是挖给他们吧。
The president of the Chamber of Commerce came just now and indeed said that the master was doing well there and was not suffering any hardships, but he had to spend some money to get out. There's only 50 yuan in the store. Now Yuchangxiang is here to hunt for goods. Judging from this list, it's still about 150 yuan, so I'd better give it to them.
早点就师傅出来要解。林大娘听说又要花钱，眼泪直淌，那一阵饿当真打得震天响。她只是摇手，说不出话，头靠在桌子上，把桌子捶得怪响。寿生瞧来不是路，悄悄地退出去。
It's important to rescue the master as soon as possible. When Mrs. Lin heard that she had to spend money again, she burst into tears. The beating was really loud. She just waved her hands and was speechless. She leaned her head on the table and beat the table loudly. Shousheng saw that there was no way to go, so he quietly left.
但在蝴蝶门边，林小姐追上来了，她的脸色像死人一样白，她的声音陡而且哑，她急口地说：“妈是气糊涂了，总说爸爸已经被他们弄死了。你赶快答应玉昌祥，赶快救爸爸，寿生哥，你。”
But at the butterfly door, Miss Lin caught up with her. Her face was as white as death, her voice was trembling and hoarse, and she said hastily, "Mom is so angry. She always says that Dad has been killed by them. You, please promise you Changxiang and save Dad as soon as possible. Brother Shousheng, you."
林小姐说到这里，忽然脸一红，就飞快地跑进去了。寿生望着她的后影，呆立了半分钟光景，然后转身，下决心担负这挖货给玉昌祥的责任，至少师妹是和他一条心要这么办了。
When Miss Lin said this, she suddenly blushed and ran in quickly. Shousheng looked at her back and stood blankly for half a minute, then turned around and determined to take on the responsibility of poaching goods for Yu Changxiang. At least the junior sister agreed with him to do so.
夜饭已经摆在店铺里了，寿生也没有心思吃，立等着玉昌祥交过钱来。他拿100在手里，另外身边藏了80，就飞跑去找上会长。半点钟后，寿生和林先生一同回来了，跑进内宅。
Dinner was already placed in the shop, and Shousheng didn't want to eat it. He immediately waited for Yu Changxiang to hand over the money. He took 100 in his hand and another 80 hidden beside him, and ran to find the president of the Chamber of Commerce. Half an hour later, Shousheng and Mr. Lin came back together. Run into the inner house.
的时候，林大娘看见了，倒吓一跳。认明是当真活的林先生时，林大娘急急爬在瓷观音前磕响头，比她打饿的声音还要响。林小姐光着眼睛站在旁边，像是要哭，又像是要笑。
When she arrived, Mrs. Lin was shocked when she saw it. When she found out that it was Mr. Lin who was really alive, Mrs. Lin hurriedly crawled in front of the porcelain guanyin and kowtowed, which was louder than her snoring. Miss Lin stood beside her with bare eyes, as if she was about to cry, but also as if she was about to laugh.
寿生从身旁掏出一个纸包来，放在桌子上说：“这是多下来的80块钱。”林先生叹了一口气，过一会儿，方才有声没气地说道：“让我死在那边就是了，又花钱弄出来，没有钱。”
Shousheng took out a paper bag from his side, put it on the table and said, "That's an extra $80. Mr. Lin sighed, and after a while, he said breathlessly, "Just let me die over there and spend money to get it out. There is no money."
大家还是死路一条。林大娘突然从地下跳起来，着急的想说话，可是一连串的把她的话塞住了。林小姐忍住了声音，抽抽噎噎的哭。林先生却还不哭，又叹一口气，哽咽着说：“
Everyone is still dead." Mrs. Lin suddenly jumped up from the ground and wanted to speak anxiously, but a series of ughs blocked her words. Miss Lin held back her voice and sobbed and cried. Mr. Lin didn't cry yet and sighed again. After taking a breath, Jian swallowed and said,
货是挖空了，店开不成，债又逼得紧。师傅，寿生叫了一声，用手指蘸着茶，在桌子上写了一个走字给林先生看。林先生摇头，眼泪扑簌簌的直淌。他看看林大娘，又看看林小姐。
The goods are hollowed out. The store can't be opened, and the debts are pressing hard. Master. Shousheng shouted, dipped his finger in the tea, and wrote the word "go" on the table for Mr. Lin to see. Mr. Lin shook his head, tears streaming down his face. He looked at Aunt Lin, looked at Miss Lin again.
又叹一口气，师傅，只有这一条路了。店里拼凑起来还有100块，你带了去，过1-2个月也就够了。这里的事，我和他们理直。寿生低声说。可是林大娘却偏偏听得了，她忽然抑住了恶。
Another sigh. Master. This is the only way. We put it together in the store and there is still 100 yuan. You can take it with you. It will be enough in a month or 2. I will straighten things out with them. Shousheng whispered. But Mrs. Lin could hear it, and she suddenly suppressed her words.
抢着叫道：“你们也去！你阿孝，放我一个人在这里好了，我拼老命！”忽然一场哨剑起来，林大娘转身跑到楼上去了。林小姐叫着妈，随后也追了上去。林先生望着楼梯发怔。
He rushed to shout. You guys go too. You, axe you. Just leave me here alone. I'll fight for my life. Ugh. Suddenly feeling unusually healthy, Mrs. Lin turned around and ran upstairs. Miss Lin called Mom and then chased after her. Mr. Lin looked at the stairs in confusion.
心里感到有什么要紧的事，却又乱麻麻的，总是想不起。寿生又低声说：“师傅，你和师妹一同走吧。师妹在这里，师母是不放心的。她总说他们要来抢。”林先生淌着眼泪点头。
I felt like there was something important in my heart, but I couldn't remember it. Shousheng whispered again. Master, you and my junior sister should go together. My junior sister is here, and my wife is worried. She always says that they are coming to rob. Mr. Lin nodded with tears in his eyes.
可是打不起主意，寿生忍不住眼圈也红了，叹一口气，绕着桌子走。忽然听得林小姐的哭声，林先生和寿生都一跳。他们赶到楼梯头时，林大娘却正从房里出来。
But I can't make up my mind. Shousheng couldn't help but the circles under his eyes were red. He sighed and walked around the table. Suddenly I heard Miss Lin crying. Mr. Lin and Shousheng were both jumped. When they arrived at the head of the stairs, Mrs. Lin was coming out of the room.
手里捧一个皮纸包，看见林先生和寿生都已在楼梯头了，他就缩回房去，嘴里说：“你们也来听我的主意。”他当着林先生和寿生的跟前，指着那纸包说道：“这是我的私房。”
He held a leather bag in his hand. Seeing that Mr. Lin and Shousheng were already at the head of the stairs, she retreated to her room and said, "Come here too and listen to my idea." In front of Mr. Lin and Shousheng, she pointed at the paper bag and said, "Dash. This is my private room, eh."
光景有200多块，分一半你们拿去。阿秀，我做主配给寿生。明天阿秀和他爸爸同走。我不走，寿生陪我几天再说。知道我还有几天活。你们就在我面前拜一拜，我也放心。
The scene cost more than 200 yuan. Take half of it. Well. Xiao, I decide how to allocate longevity. Well, Axia will go with her father tomorrow. I'm not leaving. Shousheng will stay with me for a few days before we talk. Knowing that I still have a few days to live, you just bow before me, I feel relieved. Well.
林大娘一手拉着林小姐，一手拉着寿生，就要他们拜一拜。都拜了，2个人脸上绯红，都低着头。寿生偷眼看林小姐，看见她的泪痕中含着一些笑意，寿生心头补补地跳了。
Aunt Lin held Miss Lin in one hand and Shousheng in the other, asking them to bow down. They all bowed, their faces flushed and their heads lowered. Shousheng glanced at Miss Lin secretly and saw a smile in her tears. Shousheng's heart skipped a beat.
反倒落下2滴眼泪。林先生松一口气，说道：“好吧，就是这样。可是寿生，你留在这里对付他们，万事要细心。”林家铺子终于倒闭了，林老板逃走的新闻传遍了全镇。
Instead, she shed 2 tears. Mr. Lin breathed a sigh of relief and said, "Okay, that's it. But Shousheng, you stay here to deal with them, you have to be careful in everything." 7. Lin's shop finally closed down. News of Boss Lin's escape spread throughout the town.
债权人中间的恒源庄首先派人到林家铺子里封存底货，他们又搜寻账簿，一本也没有了。问寿生，寿生躺在床上害病，又去逼问林大娘，林大娘的回答是连珠炮似的打嗝和眼泪鼻涕。
Hengyuan village, among the creditors, first sent people to Lin's shop to seal up the underlying goods. They searched the account books again. Not a single one left. Ask Shousheng. Shousheng was lying in bed sick. Hengyuan village, among the creditors, first sent people to Lin's shop to seal up the underlying goods. They searched the account books again. Not a single one left. Ask Shousheng. Shousheng was lying in bed sick. I went to question Aunt Lin again. Mrs. Lin's answer was a barrage of hiccups, tears, and runny nose.
为的他到底是林大娘，人们也没有办法。11点钟光景，大群的债权人在林家铺子里吵闹得异常厉害。恒源庄和其他的债权人争执怎样分配底货。铺子里虽然淘空，但连生财合计。
Because she is Aunt Lin, after all, people can't do anything about it. At 11 o'clock, a large group of creditors made an extremely loud noise in Lin's shop. Hengi Wanzwang and other creditors disputed how to distribute the underlying goods. Although the shop was empty, it didn't even include making money.
也足够偿还债权者70%，然而谁都只想给自己争得90%或净值10%。商会长说的舌头都有点僵硬了，却没有结果。来了2个警察，拿着木棍站在门口吆喝那些看热闹的闲人。
It is enough to repay creditors 70%, but everyone only wants to get 90% or even 100% for themselves. The president of the Chamber of Commerce spoke so hard that his tongue was a little stiff, but there was no result. 2 policemen came, standing at the door with wooden sticks and shouting at the idle people watching the excitement.
怎么不让我进去？我有300块钱的存款呀！我的老板。朱三阿泰扭着瘪嘴唇和警察争论，微颤颤地在人堆里挤。他额上的青筋就有小指头那么粗， 他挤了一会儿。
Why don't you let me in? I have a savings of 300 yuan. My old boss. Mrs. Zhu San twisted her lips and argued with the police, trembling as she squeezed in the crowd. The vein on her forehead was as thick as her little finger. She squeezed for a while.
忽然看见张寡妇抱着5岁的孩子在那里哀求另一个警察放他进去。那警察斜着眼睛，假装是调弄那孩子，却偷偷地用手背在张寡妇的乳部揉摸。张家嫂呀！
Suddenly, I saw Widow Zhang holding her 5-year-old child, begging another policeman to let her in. The policeman squinted his eyes and pretended to tease the child, but secretly rubbed Widow Zhang's breasts with the back of his hand. Sister-in-law Zhang.
朱三阿太气喘喘地叫了一声，就坐在石阶岩上，用力地扭着他的瘪嘴唇。张寡妇转过身来，找寻是谁唤他，那警察却用了谢腻的口吻叫道：“不要性急，再过一会儿就进去。”
Mrs. Zhu San gave a breathless cry and sat on the edge of the stone steps, twisting her puckered lips vigorously. Widow Zhang turned around, looking for who was calling her, but the policeman shouted in a profane tone. Don't be impatient. We'll go in after a while.
听得这句话的闲人都笑起来了。张寡妇装作不懂，含着一泡眼泪，无目的地又走了一步，恰好看见朱三阿太坐在石阶岩上喘气。张寡妇跌撞似的也到了朱三阿太的旁边。
Everyone who heard this started laughing. Widow Zhang pretended not to understand. With tears in her eyes, she took another step aimlessly. I happened to see Mrs. Zhu San sitting on the edge of the stone steps, panting. Widow Zhang also stumbled to the side of Mrs. Zhu San.
也坐在那石阶岩上，忽然就放声大哭。他一边哭一边喃喃地诉说着：“阿大的爷啊，你丢下我去了，你知道我是多么苦啊！强盗兵打杀了你，前天是3周年绝子绝孙的林老板又倒了铺子。”
Sitting on the edge of the stone steps, I suddenly burst into tears. She cried and murmured, Dash. My lord, you left me behind. You know how miserable I am. The bandit soldiers killed you. The day before yesterday was the 3rd anniversary. Boss Lin, who has no sons and no grandsons, collapsed his shop again.
我10个指头做出来的百几十块钱丢在水里了，也没响一声。啊哟，穷人命苦，有钱人心狠。看见妈哭，孩子也哭了。张寡妇搂住了孩子，哭得更伤心。朱三阿太却不哭。
The hundreds or tens of dollars I made with my 10 fingers was thrown into the water, and it didn't make a sound. Ah yo. The life of the poor is miserable, and the rich are cruel. Seeing the mother cry, the child also cried. Widow Zhang hugged the child and cried even more sadly. Mrs. Zhu San did not cry.
努起了一对发红的已经凹陷的眼睛，发疯似的反复说着一句话：穷人是一条命，有钱人也是一条命，少了我的钱，我拼老命。此时有一个人从铺子里挤出来，正是桥头陈老七。
Nu raised a pair of red and sunken eyes and repeated one sentence like crazy, Dash. A poor person has a life, and a rich person also has a life. Without my money, I will fight for my life. At this time, a person squeezed out of the shop. It was Quoto Chen Laochi.
他满脸紫青，一边挤一边回过头去嚷骂道：“你们这伙强盗，看你们有好报！天火烧，地火爆，总有一天陷在我陈老七眼睛里啊！要吃倒账就大家吃，分摊到一个边皮也是公平。”
His face was purple and blue, and while squeezing, he turned around and yelled, Dash. You gang of robbers. Look, you will be rewarded. The sky is burning, the earth is scorching, and one day it will be in my eyes, Chen Laochi. If you want to take the blame, let everyone eat it. It is fair to share it with one person.
陈老七正骂得起劲，一眼看见了朱三阿太和张寡妇，就叫着他们的名字说：“三阿太，张家嫂，你们怎么坐在这里哭？货色，他们分完了。我一张嘴吵不过他们10几张嘴，这帮狗强盗不讲理。”
Chen Laochi was scolding vigorously when he saw Mrs. Zhu San and Widow Zhang, and called their names and said, Third wife, Mrs. Zhang, why are you sitting here crying? They have finished dividing the goods. I can't quarrel with more than 10 of them with one mouth. These bandits are unreasonable.
硬说我们的钱不算账。张寡妇听说，哭得更加苦了。先前那个警察忽然又学过来，用木棍子拨着张寡妇的肩膀说：“喂，哭什么？你的养家人早就死了，现在还哭哪一个？狗屁！”
He insists that our money is not accounted for. When Widow Zhang heard this, she cried even more bitterly. The policeman from before suddenly came over again, pushed Widow Zhang on the shoulder with a wooden stick and said, Hey, why are you crying? Your adoptive family is long dead. Who is crying now? He insists that our money is not accounted for. When Widow Zhang heard this, she cried even more bitterly. The policeman from before suddenly came over again, pushed Widow Zhang on the shoulder with a wooden stick and said, "Hey, why are you crying? Your adoptive family is long dead. Who is crying now? Shit."
人家抢了我们的，你这东西也要来调戏女人吗？陈老七怒冲冲地叫起来，用力将那警察推了一把。那警察睁圆了怪眼睛，扬起棍子就想要打。闲人们都大喊，骂那警察。
People robbed us. Do you want to tease women too? Chen Laoqi shouted angrily and pushed the policeman hard. The policeman's eyes widened and he raised his stick to hit him. The idlers shouted and cursed the policeman.
另一个警察赶快跑来，拉开了陈老七说：“你在这里吵也是白吵，我们和你无怨无仇，商会里叫来守门，吃这碗饭没办法。陈老七，你到党部里去告状吧。”人堆里有一个声音这么喊。
Another policeman ran over quickly, pulled Chen Laoqi away and said, "It's useless for you to argue here. We have no grudges against you. The Chamber of Commerce has called the gatekeepers. There is nothing we can do about this bowl of rice. Chen Laoqi, go to the party headquarters and complain." A voice in the crowd shouted.
听声音就知道是本街有名的闲汉陆和尚。去，看他们怎样说。许多声音乱叫了，但是那位做吊人的警察却冷笑，扳着陈老七的肩膀道：“我劝你少找点麻烦吧，到那边中什么用？”
From the sound of his voice, he knew it was the famous Xianhan monk Lu in the street. "Go, go. See what they say." Many voices screamed. But the policeman who was the mediator sneered, pulled Chen Laoqi's shoulder and said, "I advise you to stop making trouble. What's the use of winning over there?"
你还是等候林老板回来和他算账，他倒不好白赖。陈老七糊起了脸孔，弄得没有主意了。经不住那些闲人们都撺耸着去，他就看着朱三阿泰和张寡妇说道：“去怎样？
You'd better wait for Boss Lin to come back and settle the score with him. He won't let it go in vain." Chen Laoqihu became angry and ran out of ideas. Unable to resist the idle people who encouraged him to go, he looked at Mrs. Zhu San and Widow Zhang and said, "How about going?"
那边是天天大叫保护穷人的呀。不错，昨天他们扣住了林老板，也是说防他逃走，穷人的钱没有着落。又一个主张去的拉长了声音叫，于是不由自主似的。
People over there are shouting to protect the poor every day. Good. Yesterday they detained Boss Lin to prevent him from escaping, and the poor man's money was nowhere to be found. Another person who wanted to go shouted in a longer voice. It seemed like he couldn't help it.
陈老七他们三个和一群闲人都向党部所在那条路去了。张寡妇一路上还是啼哭，咒骂打杀了她丈夫的强盗兵，咒骂绝子绝孙的林老板，又咒骂那个恶狗似的警察。快到了目的地时，
Chen Laoqi, the three of them and a group of idlers all went to the road where the party headquarters was. Widow Zhang was still crying along the way, cursing the bandit soldiers who killed her husband, cursing Boss Lin who had no sons and grandsons, and cursing the policeman who was like a vicious dog. When we almost arrived at our destination,
望见那门前排立着4个警察，都拿着棍子，远远的就吆喝道：“滚开，不准过来！我们是来告状的，林家铺子倒了，我们存在那里的钱都拿不到。”陈老七走在最前排，也高声地说
I saw 4 policemen standing in front of the door, all holding sticks. They shouted from a distance, "Go away. Don't come over. We are here to file a complaint. The Lin's shop has collapsed, and we can't even get the money we saved there. Chen Laoqi was walking in the front row and also said loudly.
可是从警察背后突然跳出一个黑麻子来，怒声喝打。警察们却还站着，只用嘴威吓。陈老七背后的闲人们大噪起来。黑麻子怒叫道：“不识好歹的贱狗，我们这里管你们那些事吗？再不走！”
But suddenly a black pockmarked person jumped out from behind the policeman, shouting and beating him angrily. But the policemen still stood and only used their mouths to threaten. The idlers behind Chen Laoqi started to make a loud noise. Hey Motzi shouted angrily. You ignorant bitch. Do we care about your affairs here? Don't leave.
就开枪了。他跺着脚和那4个警察动手打。陈老七是站在最前，已经挨了几棍子。闲人们大乱。朱三阿太老迈跌倒了。张寡妇慌忙中落掉了鞋子，给人们一冲，也跌在地下。
Just shoot. He stamped his feet and shouted at the 4 policemen to start beating him. Chen Laoqi was standing at the front and had already received several sticks. The idlers were in chaos. Zhu Sana was too old and fell down. Widow Zhang fell in panic. Shoes, when people hit them, fell to the ground.
他连滚带爬躲过了许多跳过的和踏上来的脚，站起来跑了一段路，方才觉到他的孩子没有了。看衣襟上时有几滴血。啊哟，我的宝贝，我的心肝，强盗杀人了，玉皇大帝救命呀！
She rolled and rolled to avoid many jumping and stepping feet. She stood up and ran for a while, and then she realized that her child was gone. When I looked at the lapel, there were a few drops of blood. Oh. My baby. My sweetheart. The robber killed someone. Jade Emperor, help me.
他带哭带嚷的快跑，头发分散。待到他跑过那倒闭了的林家铺面时，他已经完。